Gottlieb and Schneider have done everything they can to barricade the door, but it still might not be enough. The force on the other side strikes the door again and again, rattling the integrity of the barricade. The horrific sounds of snarling and growling emanate through the metal. They're driven by some unholy mix of hunger and fury, the creatures outside. And given enough time, they will get in. Security Officer Schneider injects the magazine of his handgun and counts the remaining bullets. 5. That's not enough to take down even one of these monsters, let alone the army assembled outside. The deep scratches on his cheeks sting like battery acid. He'd survived 2 different SCP-682 security breaches. Was this really how he was going to die? He turned his gaze to the man in the lab coat, pacing back and forth. Dr. Roy Gottlieb nervously wrings his hands. He can't help but feel reasonable for the terror he's unleashed on Site-19. But that's really only the start of this. If this nightmare gets out, the whole world would be at risk. What an incredibly stupid way to bring about an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. And it's all his fault. The result of one silly little experiment. The barricade buckles and the doors burst open. Dr. Gottlieb and Officer Schneider brace themselves. There's a lethal rainbow of fur, packed tight, waiting for them on the other side. But let's rewind a few hours to before everything went sideways at Site-19. It's true that poor Dr. Gottlieb had triggered the containment breach that would take many lives, but it's also true that nobody could have seen this particular scenario coming, as Dr. Gottlieb wheeled a containment unit full of incredibly expensive animal costumes into Research Cell 109B. Of course, these weren't just any animal costumes. They were fursuits, specifically tailored outfits, meant to represent the anthropomorphized animal persona, or fursona, of a member of the furry subculture. Furries enjoy role-playing as these characters at meetups or conventions, and for the more mysteriously wealthy of these furries, the fursuits can cost more than a designer 3-piece suit. Nobody knew exactly where Dr. Gottlieb had obtained the several fursuits he intended to use in testing that day, but Dr. Gears had inexplicably approved his proposal to test them in SCP-914, the Clockworks. For those not in the know, this fantastical machine, formed of 2 booths labeled Intake and Output, a control console, and a vast and mysterious array of clockwork mechanisms, is capable of transforming anything placed into it in a variety of ways, depending on whether it's set to rough, coarse, 1-to-1, fine, and very fine. Dr. Gottlieb, driven by an implacable curiosity, was ready to find out how these settings would alter his mysteriously obtained selection of fursuits. Research Assistant Klein took the first of the fursuits, a high-quality blue and purple bear costume, and placed it into the intake booth. Dr. Gottlieb switched the setting to rough and set the great rumbling beast of a machine into motion. After a brief conversion period, the output booth opened, revealing the tattered remains of the blue and purple bear fursuit, looking like it'd been put through an industrial paper shredder. It was an almost criminal waste of $3,000, but Dr. Gottlieb was unfazed. Once Researcher Assistant Klein had finished sweeping the desecrated remains of the suit out of the booth, it was time to move on to the second phase of testing. A fursuit of a brightly colored toucan was placed into the intake booth by Research Assistant Klein. Dr. Gottlieb set the machine to coarse, and once it was done, the result was a pile of neatly cut fabric strips, as though the suit had been dismantled by a tailor for parts. This was about in line with what Dr. Gottlieb expected, and once Klein had removed the pieces of fabric from the output booth, he was ready for things to get a little more interesting. A turquoise monkey fursuit was next placed into the Clockworks on the 1-to-1 setting. Once the machine was activated, the fursuit became a bright red gorilla fursuit. This made sense, seeing as the 1-to-1 setting always produced something that was roughly equivalent to the item placed into the intake booth. Rather than wasting another fursuit, Dr. Gottlieb made Researcher Klein move that same red gorilla fursuit back into the intake booth and set the setting to fine. The result, essentially the same fursuit, but made out of a much higher quality material and with a better sense of craftsmanship. It would have a retail value of around $2,800, which would hopefully recoup some of the financial loss incurred by the fursuits annihilated during the first and second round of testing. But really, all of this was just a prelude. The true allure of SCP-914, the thing that kept researchers coming back, whether they liked to admit it or not, was the very fine setting. It was the ultimate wildcard. Anything placed into the machine would be anomalously improved, with entirely unpredictable effects. Dr. Gottlieb would never admit it, but deep down, he held a forbidden desire: the perfect fursuit. The ultimate addition to his collection. Something that would make him the belle of the ball at any furry convention he attended in his off hours, providing he could sneak the perfect anomalous fursuit out of Site-19 after testing. That's why the fursuit reserved for the very fine test was of his own fursona, Jackson, a brilliant blue fox, and a costume he had worn many, many times, and hoped to wear many times more. If only he knew the horror he was about to unleash. When Research Assistant Klein placed the Jackson fursuit into the intake booth, Dr. Gottlieb feverishly twisted the knob on the selection panel to very fine. Yes, oh yes, he would have his prize. The machine shuddered and chugged, its huge mass of steampunk circuitry imbuing the Jackson suit with impossible anomalous power. When the output booth opened, fog spilled out into the room, with all the pomp and circumstance of Darth Vader's introduction in A New Hope. And yet, it seemed like inside, there was just the same old fursuit. Brilliant blue Jackson. Dr. Gottlieb's heart sank. All this effort, all the destroyed fursuits, it had all been for nothing. With a great sense of personal disappointment, Dr. Gottlieb ordered Research Assistant Klein to collect Jackson and finish the test. But as Klein approached, the unpredictable anomalous effect imbued by the Clockworks started to take effect. Jackson, a supposedly inert suit on the ground of the output booth, began to writhe and wriggle, as though filled with rats. Klein was startled, but he didn't react quickly enough to save himself from the nightmare about to unfold. Jackson leapt onto Klein with a nightmarish screech. The fibers burned when they touched his skin, burrowing into his every pore. As the fursuit enveloped him, Klein screamed in terrible agony, but it evoked no sympathy in the monster swallowing him whole. Dr. Gottlieb could hardly believe what he was seeing. His favorite fursuit was bonding to his research assistant, covering him and hijacking his body like a parasite. Even when the suit had fully covered Klein's body, the poor man did not stop screaming. Every moment was agony, but he was no longer in control. The figure that had once been Klein turned on him. It was like a nightmare come to life. Gottlieb saw the glassy eyes of Jackson staring at him. It was time to run. Gottlieb turned on his heel and sprinted out of the testing chamber. He heard the footsteps of Jackson speeding behind him, claws pounding on tiles. Klein's screams echoing out of the suit like a siren. There was no time to even process what was happening. This terrible new monster needed to be stopped. There were 2 armed guards out of the hall. Gottlieb yelled for them to respond, that something dangerous was chasing him. When the guards pulled their pistols and prepared for a fight, they never could have expected a bright blue fursuit with a shrieking man inside to shamble out of Research Cell 109-B. For a moment they suppressed laughter, but when the stranger began running towards them, they opened fire and peppered the humanoid monster with bullets. Klein screamed inside the suit as the bullets perforated him, but the suit itself, controlling his every motion, did not hesitate. It ran up to one of the guards and grabbed him by the chin and back of the head. With one sharp twist and a crunch, the guard fell to the ground. SCP-173 would be proud. The other guard was less lucky. At least the first died quickly. As Gottlieb watched in confusion and horror, Jackson chomped down onto the surviving guard's arm. The guard let out a pained yelp, but seconds later, Jackson pulled away, and watched as the awful transformation began. The guard spasmed and seized, his veins coursing with poison. Clumps of red fur sprouted from his skin, his skeletal structure growing and warping. After a few moments of painful transformation, the guard became something else entirely. A fursuit, a giant anthropomorphic parrot to be specific. Where there had once been one, now there were a terrible 2. Dr. Gottlieb sounded the alarm and ran for his life. Things descended into chaos relatively quickly after that. A mobile task force was dispatched to the site, told that there was an aggressive and possibly pathogenic anomaly rapidly spreading through Site-19. But when they saw that the threat in question was a gaggle of vicious mutant furries, they paused for a moment of confusion. And that moment was all the monsters needed to take advantage of. In hallway 15C, some researchers were cowering as a gaggle of colorful humanoid coyotes bore down on them. It was impossible to tell if the people they once were laughing or crying. In the break room, Dr. Clef was wielding his favorite pump-action shotgun. A bright green baboon was running at him when Clef unleashed a blast full of buckshot into the freakish furry's chest, sending it skidding across the ground and into the announcement board. Blood spread out across the suit, but the monster was not dead. It quickly righted itself, twisting and setting its bones back into place. It had shrugged off the shotgun blast with little effort. Luckily for Dr. Clef, he still had plenty of ammo left, and he was more than eager to impart it into the anomalous body of his new semi-human friend. One of the D-class bunks, on the other hand, were an absolute bloodbath. Most of the prisoners were sleeping when the man fused with a crocodile suit tore open the reinforced door. They didn't even have time to scream before several mutant furries ran in and started biting them, kicking off a flurry of horrifying transformations. By the time they were done, it looked like a cartoon zoo in there. And soon enough, Site-19 had a zoo loose. The mobile task force were hopelessly outmatched. Even with high-powered assault rifles, they somehow couldn't slow the advance of the furry menace. Their claws tore through tactical gear like cheap toilet paper. The one saving grace when the MTF operatives transformed was that their big, cartoonish hands no longer had the dexterity to operate guns. Not that it stopped them from causing all manner of carnage. One security guard, Officer Schneider, watched his entire squad get infected and brutally transform. Every second of it looked unimaginably painful, to lose yourself and become something else. He grabbed the rifle with the highest stopping power he could find and opened fire onto the beast men pursuing him. Headshots did not kill them, but it seemed to at least slow them down more than body shots. He was not going to get murdered or changed by one of these Technicolor horrors. There had to be someone who knew what was going on and how to stop it. Meanwhile, the one person who did know what was going on, Dr. Gottlieb, had no idea how to solve it. He'd sequestered himself away in one of the most secure and secretive research chambers in the facility, an automated surgical theater. He'd been able to use a high-powered tranquilizer to briefly subdue the Jackson Klein creature and strap it to a surgical gurney with heavy restraints. It didn't take long for the creature to come to again, struggling against its bindings. "Don't worry, Klein," Gottlieb said as he readied his scalpel and approached the bound anomaly. "I'm gonna get you out of there." He felt tremendous guilt for everything he'd triggered, but if he could save Patient Zero, perhaps he could save them all, undo the damage he'd done. He made an incision on the front of his beloved Jackson suit, the one that had caused all this pain, and tried to pull it open, hoping to rip Klein from his anomalous bindings. But the Klein inside was not the one he remembered. It was a skeleton, covered in woven fibers like a new nervous system. Klein had been digested inside Jackson. Whatever was happening to all these people, it was permanent, irreversible. Dr. Gottlieb had killed them all. As if activated by Gottlieb's fear, the fursuit began wriggling again. It closed over what was left of Klein and shook the gurney with tremendous force. The restraints started to buckle and rip. Gottlieb needed to run. He darted out of the room, closing the secure door behind him, hoping that will at least buy him some time. Out in the hall, he ran into Security Officer Schneider, who managed to narrowly escape the anomalous furries with his life. But he was not unscathed. His tactical armor was damaged, and there were deep ruts clawed into one of his cheeks. Dr. Gottlieb was sobbing. He choked out a confession. This was all his fault. He caused it. Everyone was dead, or changed. There was nothing. This brings us back to the start of our sordid tale. Dr. Gottlieb was standing in the barricaded room with Officer Schneider as the mutant furries burst in through the door. Gottlieb braced to be bitten, to be beaten, but it never happened. They didn't attack Officer Schneider either, because it was already too late. The scratch had worked its magic slower than the bite, but he was still infected. Officer Schneider became a colorful plush animal like all the others, and Dr. Gottlieb was alone. They all stood still, watching.
"What are you waiting for?"
Dr. Gottlieb screamed in a moment of madness.
"What are you all waiting for?"
They didn't infect Dr. Gottlieb. Instead, as a unit, they guided him back to Research Cell 109-B. Despite his protests, he was forced into the intake booth of SCP-914. He banged his fist on the door and screamed to be let out, but nothing happened. All the furries stood outside and silently watched. Jackson, who had once been Klein, approached the control panel and switched the selection to rough. You've just had a night of your life in beautiful Las Vegas, Nevada. You spend hours shooting craps, dancing in clubs, and eating more than your fill at the famous all-you-can-eat buffets. You're staggering back to your hotel room, high on life in the early hours of the morning when you notice something strange. A long dark tunnel just off the side of the strip. You didn't notice it on the way in, perhaps because you were distracted by all the glitz, glamour, and hypnotic casino lights. You see the tunnel, and your overstimulated mind feels drawn to it. You stumble in and start walking. During your walk, you can feel your bones cracking. They don't shatter like you've just been hit by a train. They shift. You feel the entire shape of you bending into something different, but it doesn't stop with your skeleton. Your organs start to feel strange, and then your skin. In the complete darkness of the tunnel, you have no idea what's going on, so you just keep walking. Eventually, you find your way into a lush green forest. It's beautiful, but it feels like it should be a million miles away from the arid desert of Nevada. You were only in the tunnel for a few minutes. What gives? "Hello?" you call out. "Is anybody there?" No answer. You explore further into this empty forest. Its trees are far as the eye can see, but no animals. That's when you see something that catches your eye. A puddle of crystal clear water. But it's not the puddle itself that draws your attention. It's what reflects back at you when you stare into it. At first, you can hardly believe it, but as you move your mouth in shock and the reflection moves its mouth too, it's suddenly all too real. You've been turned into a fox, an orange, bushy-tailed fox. You scream and bolt all the way back to the tunnel that led you here. You sprint through and feel your entire body changing once more. When you finally hit the wall of dry Vegas heat on the other side, you're human again. You breathe a sigh of relief and stumble back to your hotel room. The next day, you only vaguely remember what happened, and because you're not crazy, you assume it was just all a wild dream. What you just encountered is a Euclid-class SCP known as SCP-2746, a seemingly innocent tunnel near the Vegas Strip, which holds a portal to a fantastical world designated by the Foundation as SCP-2746-1. By the time the Foundation discovered and secured the SCP-2746 tunnel and began sending their field agents and researchers on fact-finding expeditions inside, the place was already a ghost town. A forested landmass approximately 111 kilometers in diameter, with no notable signs of life. The Foundation discovered that this place had a strange effect on people and animals who came in from our world. Humans who entered assumed the form of a random animal, but retained their intelligence and vocal cords, creating talking animals. Animals brought into 2746-1 retained their animalistic intelligence, but grew human-like vocal cords, allowing them to repeat simple phrases. Before the mass exodus or extinction event that left 2746-1 barren, the Foundation figured out that this place was populated by a whole civilization of intelligent animals, like something out of a fairy tale. These animals, through a mix of brains and magic, were able to leave written records and create impressive architecture, like homes and places of worship. Foundation researchers became fascinated with how exactly this society operated and what could have led to its sudden downfall. Thanks to a mix of advanced archaeology and records left behind by the creatures, this is what the Foundation determined. The society these talking, intelligent animals lived in was a kind of religious oligarchy, meaning power was consolidated by the few in the top social class. Society was divided into three segments: crafters, scholars, and honorables, with the crafters being the most powerful members of society and honorables being the least powerful. The state-sponsored churches acted in worship of a being simply called the Maker, who fills a similar role to the Abrahamic God. The crafters, whose number totaled 13, were believed to be immortal and were responsible for building the majority of the culture and architecture found in 2746-1. The scholars acted as their wise assistants, and the honorables were a mixed class of artists, carpenters, and artisans. It seemed that this culture had a pretty good thing going. no system of currency was ever invented, and the economy operated on a barter system. The Foundation believes that initially, the citizens of this world didn't need to eat to survive, and so only needed to barter for material goods. Though it's worth noting that the conditions of immortality only apply to natives of this region. People born on Earth but assuming animal forms while entering 2746-1 still need nutrition to survive. However, a great tragedy soon caused a fundamental shift in the balance of life and society within 2746-1. The Maker decided it wanted to test or punish its subjects with two major changes. First, humans would be forbidden from entering the domain. And second, the Maker now made the consumption of food necessary for continued survival and sanity. Nothing was ever the same. Because nobody had needed to eat prior to this, food stores had never been made, and the inhabitants had no agricultural knowledge that would allow them to easily mass-produce more. As a result, while the crafters and scholars were able to feed on fruits from luxurious private gardens, the honorables were forced to resort to eating each other or other inhabitants of 2746-1. This began a bloody rift that split society from the top down. One half, led by the powerful crafters Sari and Seward, wanted to preserve society as it was and continue to worship the Maker. Sari took the form of a Flemish giant rabbit, and Seward appeared as a house cat. The opposition, led by former crafters Frederick and Agathos, with the reluctant help of a scholar named Clovis, wanted to get revenge on the Maker for all he'd done and kill him, completely altering society. Don't be fooled by their appearances, though. Many of the inhabitants of 2746-1 were fiercely intelligent sorcerers, and the apocalyptic civil war they sparked came to be known to the Foundation as Event Nachash. Like many wars, there would be no real winners here, only survivors, and even then, not for long. It was a bloody and horrific war. All attempts at finding a diplomatic solution failed. Frederick and Agathos would not stop until they had the Maker's blood on their paws. In the end, though, they were defeated, and for their traitorous crimes, they were to be punished by Sari and Seward in horrific ways to make examples of them. Since neither could die, they were given fates worse than death instead. Frederick was up first. Before the war, he'd been a leader prized for his courage and ingenuity. He'd created something known as the Great Fire, which provided the kingdom with light. For his so-called atrocities against the Maker, he was given the punishment of permanent crucifixion and relocation to a place known as the Underplane. His snout was cut off his face, and he was set permanently ablaze in a manner that would leave him forever suffering and would make him appear to look like a monster to all. Next went Agathos. She was Frederick's sister and was seen as the mastermind of many of their schemes. She would be forever encased in white clay and bled through her eyes until the sin drains from her. She's now a living crying statue, existing in a state of permanent imprisonment for her part in the crimes against the Maker. Clovis, because her involvement in the coup was unwilling, was given a more minor punishment. One of her eyes was removed, and she was permanently placed in a broken human body, effectively banishing her from her home in 2746-1 forever. Though they may have won, things didn't end much better for Sari and Seward. The Civil War had fractured their world, and in the aftermath, the survivors chose to leave in hopes of finding a better life elsewhere. Sari and Seward, though, felt partially responsible for everything that had happened, and so they decided to remain in their dying world. Before they themselves died, or perhaps moved on to different forms, leaving their animal bodies behind, they left a final note. It was from this note that the Foundation learned much of the story of SCP-2746. This may seem like a pretty open and shut case, another magical realm destroyed by tragedy and civil war, much like the land of fantasy in SCP-1762. But what's really bizarre here is that this is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the stories of some of these key figures in the event Nachash. First, what became of the two rebels, Agathos and Frederick? Today, they're two parts of the feared and deadly SCP-1913. Frederick, now going by Freddy, is a nightmarish faceless fire demon in the form of a dog. slavishly devoted to the protection of his sister, Agathos, now known as Agatha, still trapped in white clay, her leaking blood now deadly to the touch. Clovis is still believed to be in league with Agathos and Frederick, and may now be related to the sinister SCP-1903, a one-eyed rabbit-like human. But strangest of all is the possible truth behind Sari and Seward, the two devotees to the Maker who remained in 2746-1 until their very last breath. In all likelihood, these two were once agents of the SCP Foundation's infamous Las Vegas branch. They took on these more animalistic forms after their deaths. Sari may have once been Agent Sarah Crowley, a Japanese-American woman who died in the line of duty in 1960. Seward was once Dr. Stuart Hayward, Crowley's partner, his new name acting as a kind of fusion of the first and last name he had in life. This is only the beginning of the animal-themed weirdness occurring around Site-45, the Foundation's Vegas branch. But this series of anomalies, collected under the term Pitch Haven, will have to wait for another video. After all, you know what they say, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Down in the depths of Facility 23, a group of scientists stand before a massive rumbling piece of machinery. They all hold their breath as the gigantic mechanism suddenly stops. It's eerily quiet for a moment before a door slides open. The scientists crane their necks to see inside, to see what the result of their great experiment was. These were some of the greatest minds in the SCP Foundation, but nothing could prepare them for what they had created. September 9th, 2008 was an unseasonably frosty day when Dr. Charles Gears, one of the SCP Foundation's most iconic scientists, parked his Honda Civic outside of what seemed like an innocuous government cold storage warehouse. He sipped his coffee and surveyed the building, which he, along with about 100 others in total, knew to be Site 19, Facility 23. Why was Dr. Gears, former director of all Euclid-level containment at Site 19, here today? Because official testing was about to begin on SCP-914. The Foundation had acquired the machine now known as SCP-914 some time ago, but only after its recent reclassification to 914 had it been relocated to Facility 23. It must have been important because the entirety of the facility was being repurposed for SCP-914 research. They were dealing with an immensely complicated piece of anomalous technology here, and the same question was on everybody's lips. What exactly does this thing do? Dr. Arthur Hackett, the facility director, had requested the cold, clinical assistance of Dr. Gears in providing the answer. Once he'd finished his morning coffee, Dr. Gears headed inside. The facility's security chief, Agent Alan Sedna, had been beefing up security at the building, and at least 2 mobile task force units were already on call in case anything happened. The first day of official testing is always a crapshoot. You might get a nice drink out of it, like with SCP-294, or you may get an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. You never really know. All Dr. Gears knew, as he walked up the granite steps to the main entrance, was that he was already feeling exhausted. When you've dealt with anomalous objects and entities for decades on end, the sense of wonder and mystery begins to wear off, only to be replaced with a kind of tedium any office worker knows all too well. Everyone knew that Dr. Gears was devoted to the job, perhaps more than anyone else, but he approached the job with an emotionless effect. You wouldn't know from looking at him if he was thinking about the deadly anomalous creature in the next room, or what he was going to have for lunch that day. The doctor passed through security and was briefed in the break room by Dr. Lucius Veritas, Director of Research at Site 19. He explained that the machine seemed to work in the absence of any power source. Its mechanical structure is similar to machinery from the Industrial Revolution, but it's exceedingly complex for something constructed in that time. Foundation analyses into the structure of the 914 machine have shown it to have as many as 8 million moving parts, and that might even be an incomplete estimate. Dr. Gears wore his trademark blank face as he listened, solemnly nodded, and asked to be shown the anomaly. He was led into Containment Chamber 109B by a pair of guards. According to all current Foundation tests, the machine doesn't appear to pose any active risk of containment breach or danger to the guards, earning it the rare safe designation. As a result, aside from guards stationed on site, containment procedures for 914 were minimal. Whether this designation would need to be changed after testing was something Dr. Gears would soon find out. SCP-914 was a truly impressive sight to behold, a giant clockwork mechanism taking up around 18 square feet, with an unfathomably complex combination of screw drives, belts, pulleys, springs, and gears. A less stoic researcher might see the humor in recruiting a Dr. Gears to test such a device, but comedy definitely wasn't one of Dr. Gears' specialties. He stared at the machine with a detached fascination, analyzing its vital components at a glance. Gears noted a large mainspring beneath a rudimentary selection panel. The panel is copper, with a large selection knob fixed to an arrow above a series of different options: rough, coarse, 1-to-1, fine, and very fine. There was also a large key below the selection panel, for the purposes of winding up the mainspring and initiating whatever procedure this machine was designed to enact. Next, Dr. Gears noticed two large booths connected to the machine by a pair of equally large copper tubes. The booth on the left labeled intake, and the right labeled output. Incredibly, Dr. Gears was able to immediately deduce the purpose of this machine. It was designed to enact some kind of transformative process on whatever was placed into the intake booth. But what kind of transformative process? That's exactly what Dr. Gears was here to find out. The experiment was simple. They would gather a series of samples, both inanimate objects and living tissue, and use them to explore the different permutations of the 914 machine's transformative abilities. This initial series of experiments were approved by O5 Command and the site director, and with the 47 researchers present in Facility 23 at his disposal, Dr. Gears commenced his research into SCP-914. To minimize risk, Dr. Gears decided the first test would be a simple kilogram of steel. On his orders, the steel was placed into the intake booth. With the doctor's approval, a junior researcher set the control panel setting to rough and began twisting the mainspring key, at which point the booth's doors closed and a small bell inside chimed. The machine began to rumble, its 8 million working pieces churning into life. It continued like this for around 10 minutes before falling silent, at which point the output booth opened. What had once been a single lump of steel weighing 1 kilogram was now an uneven pile of smaller lumps, with evidence of laser cutting. Dr. Gears made note of the fact that having lasers within such a machine is both anachronistic and anomalous, and that the rough setting appears to messily cleave the object placed within the intake booth into pieces. Dr. Gears also noted that it would be unwise to test any kind of explosive material on the rough setting, unless of course they wanted to destroy the building. The research continued. Dr. Gears used another 1 kilogram lump of steel to test the 1-to-1 feature. This time the result was far more peculiar. The output booth contained the exact same weight in steel screws. This result was sparking even greater connections in Dr. Gears' impressive analytical mind. Firstly, the 1-to-1 feature caused the 914 machine to transform the output into something different from, but similar to, the intake. And while this would require further testing, it appeared that the 914 machine, despite being anomalous, does still follow the laws of physics. Samples passed through the machine conserve their mass and would not be transmuted on an atomic level from one element to another. Next, Dr. Gears pushed another lump of steel through the machine on the fine setting. The result this time was a kilogram of steel carpet tacks. From this, Dr. Gears was able to ascertain that the fine feature improves the samples placed within the intake booth somewhat. However, things got even stranger when Gears performed the same experiment on the very fine setting. The output booth provided several unknown gases and a lump of unknown metal with anomalous qualities. Namely, it was resistant to heat up to 50,000 degrees, impossible to bend or break with any force, and was a perfect conductor of electricity. Dr. Gears suddenly realized his task here may be more interesting than he'd initially imagined. Was that a bit of a smile on his face that one researcher spotted? Surely not. This was the famous unflappable Dr. Gears after all. The doctor decided to take it up a notch and began to test more complex items in the 914 machine. He removed his own wristwatch and placed it into the input booth before setting the machine to course and letting her rip. Literally, in this case. When the output booth was opened, the watch had been painstakingly disassembled into its component parts, with no damage to said parts. Dr. Gears noted the coarse feature as a more mild version of the rough, in the sense that it was able to take an object apart without any kind of fundamental damage. He also made note of the fact he'd need to get himself a new watch. Dr. Gears then asked one of the researchers to surrender their cell phone for testing. While none were excited at the prospect of their phone getting eviscerated by a clockwork behemoth, one of the researchers eventually surrendered their BlackBerry Curve to the doctor. He placed it into the intake booth on the 1-to-1 setting, and 10 minutes later, the output booth released a brand new Apple iPhone. Sadly for the researcher who donated his BlackBerry, he wasn't allowed to keep the new device. Naturally, Dr. Gears was interested in trying out the anomalous, very fine setting on a more complex object. Seeing as no other researchers were eager to hand over their personal effects, he took a Colt Python revolver from a member of security and ran that through the machine on very fine. The result was an extremely powerful energy weapon containing gamma radiation, which fired a beam capable of disintegrating anything in its path. While the weapon's power was immense, it was also too dangerous and unstable to be added to the Foundation's armory for general use. Having collected a wealth of data from more complex objects, Dr. Gears was eager to move to the next stage: live test subjects. While his fellow researchers had some reservations, the experiments pushed on, beginning with mice. A single white mouse was put into the intake booth on the 1-to-1 setting, and the machine was activated. The result 5 minutes later was an almost identical creature, save for the fact that it now had brown fur. Encouraged by the fact that the mouse survived the refinery process, Dr. Gears next applied for the use of 2 chimps in his SCP-914 experiments. The first chimp was run through the machine on the fine setting. The result was a chimp of human-level intelligence, who has since begun working for the Foundation under the alias Dr. Bobo, and the data from this test has been expunged from the official reports to protect Dr. Bobo's privacy. The second primate test, this time on Ruff, was not quite as positive. The chimp was dismembered, with the mutilated corpse showing evidence of cutting from high heat and crushing. Of course, everyone knew where these tests were eventually going. Dr. Gears requested 2 members of D-Class personnel for testing. The first was a 42-year-old Caucasian male weighing 108 kilograms and standing 185 centimeters tall. Dr. Gears ran him through SCP-914 on the 1-to-1 setting, resulting in a slightly taller Hispanic man with a slightly lower body weight. He immediately became severely confused and agitated, and attempted to attack the guards present, leading to his unfortunate termination by Foundation staff. It was on the final live test that tragedy truly struck. A 28-year-old Caucasian male was run through the machine on the highly anomalous, very fine setting. The result was an utterly nightmarish creature. So horrifying that the majority of the details on its physical appearance have been expunged from the report. The creature made a sudden escape, breaching the relatively minor containment procedures intended for the inert SCP-914. This highly dangerous creature killed 8 guards, as well as 2 senior researchers upon emerging from the output booth. A special response team was dispatched to take the creature down, but that proved harder than expected. SCP-914 had massively improved upon the human original, especially when it came to its killing ability. Eventually, it was captured, but the special response team suffered injuries and memory loss as a result of the creature's anomalous powers. The creature was also severely wounded, and its blood caused corrosive damage to the plumbing in Facility 23. The creature expired from its injuries several hours later, turning into a cloud of blue ash that blinded a nearby research team. Dr. Gears would later comment that the experiments were ultimately still a success, in spite of some minor hiccups. Testing on the device continues to this day in an effort to understand the full potential of the machine. Though, for obvious reasons, biological testing on the machine has since been forbidden, without direct authorization from O5 Command. After all, if an already dangerous SCP was ever subjected to the very fine transformation setting, we could be dealing with something beyond our greatest nightmares. Ranger Halter felt the bark of the tree trunk slamming into his back, practically knocking all the air out of his lungs as he tried desperately to slow his frantic breathing. The sound of his own panting filled him with a sudden, horrifying thought. If he could hear his own ragged breaths, then it could hear them too. He clamped a hand over his mouth, clenching his jaw shut so tightly that he thought his teeth might splinter as he pushed them together. His free hand gripped the tranquilizer gun, shuddering as the snap of a twig rang out somewhere behind him. It had caught up to him already. He could bolt, make a quick dash for a cover behind another tree, but it was close enough now that it would see him. And if it did, It would come rushing after him with a speed that even a seasoned park ranger couldn't match. As much as he tried to force himself to stay still, the petrified curiosity got the better of him. Holter peeked out from behind the tree and immediately wished he hadn't. It had all started out as what sounded like an everyday occurrence. High atop his watchtower in the Glacier National Park, Ranger Holter had been enjoying the view of Montana's Rocky Mountains, a cup of coffee from his thermos in his hand. Then the familiar squawk of his radio had cut short his appreciation of the serene scenery. Holter sighed, tossing the remaining contents of the cup over the tower's railing, wondering what kind of day he was in for as he went to answer the radio. Most of the time, things in Glacier Park were as peaceful as they looked, but the park ranger knew that staying vigilant could make all the difference when it came to finding a missing hiker in time, or the difference between deterring a group of campers away from a family of bears and having a hell of a mess to clean up. He pushed down on the button for the microphone, connected to the bulky radio that took up practically an entire desk.
Holter, thank God,
came the relieved voice from the other side.
We've been trying to reach everyone, put them on alert. We've got trouble. Reports of a coyote gone feral attacking folks.
I'm on it, Holter replied, grabbing his gear from the cramped watchtower as he continued to speak into the mic. Where did the report come in from?
Not far from your station. I'd say about a click west from your position.
Stowing his tranquilizer gun, Ranger Holter descended the ladder from his watchtower down to ground level. As a park ranger, Holter valued the environment he worked in. And as a fan of the SCP universe, we know how much you value intricate world building, or in some cases, world destroying. But either way, we couldn't be happier to introduce you to the sponsor of today's video, World Anvil. World Anvil is a comprehensive set of world building tools that not only help you craft and organize your unique setting, but also present it in a captivating manner. From wiki-like articles and interactive maps to a full-fledged RPG campaign manager and novel writing software, World Anvil has everything a world creator could dream of. World Anvil equips you with over 25 templates, prompting you to dive deeper into your creations. Enrich your content by embedding maps, images, sound effects, and even little secrets for that immersive touch. With their innovative design, you can easily visualize your world through maps, chronicle its history with timelines, and fine-tune events with intricate details. Your crafted world can be beautifully showcased on a unique homepage, inviting others to dive into your vision. Got a sudden idea while working on another? No problem. World Anvil lets you swiftly create new articles or link existing ones, ensuring you never lose track of your inspiration. But my personal favorite feature is their interactive maps. Beyond just creating and uploading your own designs, you can directly link your creations, allowing for a dynamic and engaging experience. And if you're collaborating, invite your team to refine, write, and even let your fans chip in. I'm currently working on my own interactive map of Site-17, and maybe I'll even let you see it when I'm done. But don't wait for me. Dive into World Anvil yourself and elevate your world-building game. And here's a treat. Use our link in the description to go to worldanvil.com and use the code SCP to grab a whopping 51% off any yearly subscription. Explore, create, and share with World Anvil. The sun was already starting to dip out of sight behind the trees. Pretty soon it'd be pitch black, save for the beam of his flashlight. He had to move fast. Coyotes were only known to attack humans on rare occasions. Usually they kept away, at least enough to make them a minimal risk. But waiting for him just west of the watchtower wasn't a coyote, at least not at first. Watching it from behind the tree moments later, Ranger Holter's stomach turned at the sight of the creature. It walked bipedally, like a human, but the shape was all wrong. Its legs looked broken, but that hadn't stopped it from catching up. Instead of bending at the knee, they were Z-shaped, pointing back behind the creature, then twisting back again in the opposite direction at the joint. They looked more like the legs of a dog, but they were far too big. The same could be said of the arms, bent out of shape at multiple points like its legs were. The creature was a mess of misshapen limbs. The cartilage in its ears had seemingly reformed into points, and there were claws protruding from its fingertips, practically bursting out from where a human's fingernails would be. But beneath it all, and what alarmed Ranger Holter the most, was its skin. It had darkened in patches, layers of fur sprouting over those areas, but there were still parts that remained clear, where skin, human skin, was still visible, peeling away to reveal the new fur-coated layer underneath. It looked like a grotesque accident, like something ripped straight out of an old horror movie, the kind of monster that a mad scientist would make by haphazardly splicing DNA and playing God. Holter checked the tranquilizer gun in his trembling fingers, still empty after that most recent shot. He reached for another dart, slowly sliding it into the loading mechanism and readying the pistol. It cocked and made a sound. The creature's malformed head turned, snapping directly towards the source of the noise, directly towards Holter. He turned to sprint away, trying to expand the distance between him and it. If he was too close, the dart wouldn't have enough momentum when he pulled the trigger. The toe of his boot snagged on something solid, unmoving, a root from the tree he'd been hiding behind. He felt himself tumble, landing with a hard thud against the forest floor. His gun, it had fallen from his grasp. He scrabbled around in the dirt for it, barely able to see where the tranquilizer had landed in the dark. Just as his fingertips brushed past something metal, Holter felt the force of something heavy strike his back again. This time, though, it wasn't a tree. It was the creature. It snarled, gnashing its candid jaws that were protruding out of its skull, rows of sharp teeth that had uprooted the old ones, burying themselves into the park ranger's neck and not letting go, until he'd stopped moving for good. A few short hours later, a convoy of mysterious, unmarked vehicles arrived at Glacier National Park. The rest of the park rangers who had reported the strange activity were approached by shadowy figures who refused to give their names or offer up any form of identification other than just referring to themselves as experts in things like this. Not long after, none of the others would remember Ranger Holter or the incident that had led to his untimely death. After administering amnestics, it didn't take the SCP Foundation search party long to discover a lone coyote sniffing around the remains of a park ranger covered in blood. The wild animal was captured, to be brought back for testing before being re-released into the wild. Meanwhile, the Foundation scoured the rest of the area until they came across the real culprit. Standing in a clearing a short distance from a footpath through the forest was SCP-1579. Of course, the next challenge was getting it packed up and transported to Biosite 66 without touching it. To the untrained eye, SCP-1579 looks to be fairly unassuming, even as far as anomalous objects go. It is simply an old wooden sculpture, the kind that can even be occasionally found in various wooded areas throughout the world. Its age is apparent from even one cursory glance at SCP-1579. The partial damage to its cedar surface speaking to the numerous years it has existed for, along with the bright green moss that covers it. Although, curiously, this moss doesn't seem to dry out and die in responses to changes in humidity, nor does it affect SCP-1579's structural integrity. As for where it came from and who made it, those are still unknown, as if the answer to what holds SCP-1579's anomalous properties, whether or not the cedar it was carved from or the moss coating the sculpture possesses some unknown properties, or if SCP-1579 was somehow imbued with these after being created. Initial testing by the SCP Foundation's researchers determined SCP-1579 to have an abnormally high resistance to the type of damage wood, and particularly cedar wood, is susceptible to. For one, it does not seem to show any signs of rotting or natural degradation. For another, it is also resistant to heat, at least to a certain extent. It doesn't burn the same way other objects constructed from cedar wood. However, this sculpture is not entirely indestructible. Pieces can be easily chipped off of the main body of SCP-1579, and these splintered fragments continue to carry the same anomalous effects as the rest of the sculpture, even when separate from it. But of course, you want to know about the creature. How does this supposedly harmless, if a little structurally abnormal cedar wood sculpture connects to whatever it was that killed Park Ranger Holter? Well, it's quite simple actually. SCP-1579 killed Holter. Not directly, you understand, but by proxy, through its further anomalous properties. Still confused? Well then, how about a demonstration? Let's take a look at one of the Foundation's preferred test subjects, an expendable member of D-Class personnel, probably spending multiple life sentences working here at the SCP Foundation, rather than behind the bars of a maximum security institution. Now, what would happen if you place this delightful individual in the same room as SCP-1579? Well, nothing initially. That is, until the subject touches the cedar wood surface of the sculpture, either out of curiosity or following the instructions of a Foundation researcher. That's when the real anomaly starts. The wooden sculpture will exhibit a slight but observable movement, shuddering slightly as if moved by an unseen force. This will precede the person who touched the object feeling a burning sensation, that kind of irritating, painful heat that spreads underneath the surface of the skin. The burning will always begin at the area of their body that made direct contact with SCP-1579, and touching it again at any point will trigger a reactivation of the sculpture's anomalous effects. Subjects experiencing the effects of SCP-1579 have described the feeling as being akin to a bad sunburn that rapidly spreads across the skin from the point of contact, only to stop once it has affected a person's entire body. Following the subsidence of the burning sensation, subjects experiencing the side effects of touching SCP-1579 will notice an immediate change to their skin. Within a window of 3 minutes, their skin becomes thin and paper-like in its texture, before starting to peel away. Once this stage occurs, the peeling skin will reveal a new layer underneath, hence the colloquially used codename for this anomaly, different skin. However, this so-called different skin isn't merely a new layer of otherwise ordinary human skin. Instead, it will belong to another species entirely. A person coming into contact with SCP-1579 will find themselves rapidly developing new skin that shares the physical traits, as well as matching DNA, to that of a number of animal species. It should be noted that these features will continue to rapidly develop until the subject is entirely transformed and is no longer considered to qualify as a human being. As for the specific transformation that occurs, there are a number of known outcomes that repeat in the following cycle. Let's say our D-class, we'll call them Subject A, touched SCP-1579 at the start of the cycle. They would, after the burning sensation stops and peeling begins, start to sprout dark feathers across their torso, arms, and upper legs, likely with a great deal of pain as the sharp quill of these feathers start to burst out from beneath the skin. Beneath the knees, Subject A will see their legs start to become yellow and scaly, as well as a change that causes their toenails to simply start to painfully protrude outwards until they form pointed, blackened talons. Subject A's face will also start to grow feathers. However, these grow outwards away from the areas of the nose and mouth. Flight feathers will also protrude from the forearms, multiplying in number until their entire body is covered, at which point Subject A, on every level including genetically, more closely resembles a Corvus corax, more commonly known as the common raven, than a human being anymore. Take another test subject, Subject B, and get them to touch SCP-1579 right after. Their different skin is covered in brown fur that's approximately 4 inches long. Their lips and skin underneath the fur will darken, and their nose will become constantly moist. Claws will start to grow from their fingertips, although these will be notably smaller than those of a fully grown creature of the same species, an Ursus arctos horribilis, or a grizzly bear. Then we get to the point in the cycle where some unwitting hiker encountered SCP-1579 in the forests of Glacier National Park, Montana. When this subject, Subject C, touched the cedar sculpture, their skin began to grow layered fur, as the cartilage of their ears is separated from their tissue and replaced by new, reshaped cartilage. Much like Subject B, who SCP-1579 turned into a grizzly bear, Subject C also had darkened skin, a moistened nose, and longer, sharper nails. It was at some point during this transformation that an unassuming park ranger stumbled upon Subject C. Frightened by what he saw, this ranger was unable to identify that what he interpreted as attacks by some kind of half-human, half-animal hybrid were actually desperate pleas for help, as Subject C was transformed into a coyote. Although it's hard to say which physiological change triggered by SCP-1579 is the most alarming or unpleasant to experience, the fourth kind is in no way any more pleasant than the preceding 3 in the cycle. Subject D of this particular series of tests will find the new layer of skin that emerges under the old to be hairless and of a green coloration, often with brown markings. Unlike the previous instances, their skin will rapidly begin to dry out, and seems to be far more reactive to the humidity of the surrounding environment. It is also far thinner than that of the skin possessed by other transformations that SCP-1579 causes. So thin, in fact, that the eyeballs of Subject D will be visible through its eyelids, which rapidly become translucent, similar to those of the Suracris regula, otherwise known as the Pacific tree frog.
Repeated activation of SCP-1579's anomalous properties will trigger the next transformation in the cycle, whether the cedarwood sculpture is touched by a new subject or repeatedly by the same person. In the latter instance, where a subject is re-exposed to SCP-1579, the additional changes their body undergoes will be significantly more painful. Their already newly replaced outer layer of skin will fail to dry out and will begin bleeding instead. 3 or 4 consecutive exposures to SCP-1579 will lead to excessive bodily trauma for the subject, usually causing them to die from shock before the 4th transformation is complete. And as we're sure you can imagine, an amalgamation of a human, a raven, a grizzly bear, a coyote, and a tree frog is hardly a pleasant sight. This unfortunate fate was suffered during one of the first incidents with SCP-1579 that brought the Foundation's attention to it. During an elementary school field trip, a teacher who was explaining the history of totem poles in Native American culture accidentally touched SCP-1579. While experiencing the pain of her transformation, she fell against the sculpture in a panic, not realizing it had been what caused her to change. This repeated triggering of the object's anomalous effects led to her untimely death, an event that had to be wiped from the minds of her students by the Foundation using the careful application of Class B amnestics. For now, SCP-1579 is kept in a secure, sterile environment at a Foundation storage warehouse, where personnel are not permitted to make any contact with it. So there's no need to worry about accidentally running into SCP-1579 in the wild. Although, there are always plenty of other things to worry about while out on a hike through the forest. Things that could be right behind you. Some time ago, locals began to report a surge in unusual animal attacks in the Adirondack Mountains. Living where they did, they were, of course, used to seeing wild animals. Bears poking through trash cans, raccoons stealing pieces of dog food out of bowls, rabbits hopping through the yard, or nibbling on someone's garden. But no one had ever seen anything quite like this. All of a sudden, it was as if the local wildlife was turning on humanity. Hikers were attacked by wolves, torn to shreds in the middle of the day. Raccoons caught stealing dog food could no longer be chased off with a broom and a loud noise, but would stand their ground, advancing menacingly and gnashing their teeth. Even squirrels were leaping out of trees and biting people at random. Animal control swiftly intervened, suspecting some sort of rabies outbreak. However, none of the specimens they managed to capture and bring into custody showed signs of rabies. No foaming at the mouth, no hydrophobia, only extreme aggression, the likes of which they had never seen in animals without any identifiable diseases. Meanwhile, as the animal attacks ramped up, locals also noticed that they were more common the closer one was to a certain hunting lodge nestled deep in the forest. No one knew the owner of the lodge, a mysterious man who had been seen coming and going but never stopped to talk to his neighbors or even so much as give a friendly wave. There was no reason to believe the two were connected, and yet there were whispers, rumors, that somehow he had something to do with the whole thing. Maybe he was conducting illegal animal testing at his home or had started a fur farm filled with abused animals that were escaping and seeking revenge. It all seemed a bit absurd, but the anomalous animal activity attracted the attention of the SCP Foundation. They dispatched several operatives to the area who heard the rumors of the hunting lodge and decided to take a look for themselves. When they knocked on the door to the lodge, no one answered. Inside, they could find no signs that anyone lived there or had lived there for quite some time. The building reeked of dried blood and vomit and something else, something dark and animal that no one could quite place. They followed a dark brown smear of blood on the floor to the back room of the hunting lodge, where taxidermied animal heads adorned the walls, glassy eyes staring at the SCP officers, unblinking. And there, in the back of the room, was a wooden chest. Inside, they found a pile of furs. Nothing too unusual to see in a hunting lodge, but if everything else had been cleared out of the house, then why had they left these furs behind? Something didn't quite seem right. The furs were taken into the Foundation for additional observation, where once their true nature revealed itself, they were classified SCP-801. SCP-801 refers to a collection of several separate articles of fur clothing, including one mink coat, one raccoon coat, one wolf coat, one squirrel coat, and one sable coat. Each of these coats are lined with black silk and have a full body cut, including a hood. Though they appear machine-assembled,
none of these coats have a tag or any washing or care instructions located anywhere on the garment. In addition to the coats, SCP-801 also includes 1 pair of rabbit skin mittens and 1 pair of elk skin shoes. The gloves are lined in silk, and the shoes are lined in leather. Just like the coats, they appear to be machine-assembled and lack any tags or other instructions. At first glance, there is nothing anomalous about these articles of clothing. However, once a person has put one of them on, they will rapidly begin to transform. When the coats and other items were first apprehended by the Foundation, they conducted a series of human trials using randomly selected D-Class. One man was ordered to put on the squirrel fur coat, which he did without further question. In his eyes, it was a much more appealing task than the usual affair, which could involve directly interacting with deadly, terrifying monsters, such as SCP-682. A fur coat was nothing compared to the giant lizard, but as soon as he had slipped his arms through the sleeves, the test subject felt an excruciating pain ripping through his gut. He screamed, doubling over from the agony, and cried out to the researchers to get the coat off of him, as it felt like his organs were liquefying. They refused and continued to observe the effects. Approximately 2 minutes after the onset of the pain, the subject stopped speaking in coherent words. He fell to his hands and knees, and although he continued to vocalize, it was no longer in any human language. The pitch of his voice raised higher and higher until the cries of rage and agony began to resemble squeaks and chitters. At this point, as he thrashed and writhed on the floor, the man was able to tear the coat off of his body. However, the transformation was already too far along, and removing the coat did nothing to stop the horror unfolding before the research team. As they watched, the man's face began to lengthen and warp, shaping into a snout. His eyes enlarged, migrating to the sides of his head. His ears rounded and grew, moving up and back. His teeth stretched, jutting from his mouth. His spine arched, and with a sudden spray of blood, a tail erupted from the back of his pelvis. All of this occurred over the duration of 3 minutes, and the research team looked on in shock and awe. At about 4 minutes into the transformation process, the test subject opened his mouth and began to vomit a mixture of unidentifiable organic matter onto the floor. It appeared to include bone fragments, skin, and pieces of various organs. Once he had finished expelling this material from his mouth, the subject began to writhe and thrash on the floor again, clawing at his face and body. All of a sudden, as if his skin itself were an oversized coat, his flesh came off in one large piece. It flopped to the ground, leaving a small furry creature where there had been a grown man only moments before. Only 5 minutes after he first put on the coat, there was a bald squirrel in the D-Class man's place. Then, the ultimate stage of transformation began. The squirrel squealed, eyes rolling wildly in its sockets, as brown hair began to sprout all over its body, growing at a rapid rate. As the hair burst through the skin, it expelled blood along with it, which sprayed across the room. A few unfortunate researchers got splatters of squirrel blood on their lab coats, on their notes, and even in their eyes. After all this, there was a seemingly ordinary squirrel sitting in the center of the room. Though the squirrel was ordinary in appearance, its behavior was not that of a typical squirrel. The creature lay on its side, muscles slack from fatigue, but its eyes were still rolling wildly, taking in its surroundings. Its body heaved with shallow breaths, and it appeared to be in a state of extreme distress. One researcher attempted to approach the squirrel to examine it for any potential injuries or anomalies. When he was within 1 foot of the squirrel, it launched itself off of the ground in a sudden leap, landing on the man's shoulder. Before he could stop it, the squirrel was digging its teeth into the man's neck, biting through his jugular vein. Another researcher intervened, grabbing hold of the feral squirrel, and it scrambled up his arm onto the top of his head. As the researcher screamed for help from the guards, the squirrel locked onto his scalp, drawing blood as its claws dug into the flesh. One guard aimed his weapon at the squirrel, but it climbed down onto the researcher's face, making it impossible to take out the animal without harming the man in the process. As one of the guards worked to load a tranquilizer dart into his weapon, the squirrel scratched at the researcher's eyes, resulting in wounds that would permanently blind the man for life. After all this, the guard managed to shoot the beast with a tranquilizer dart, and it slumped limply to the ground. It was subsequently caged, and the 2 injured researchers were given immediate medical attention and rabies shots. With the squirrel experiment as a baseline, the Foundation proceeded to test the remaining articles of clothing on additional D-Class. Each time, the process unfolded in pretty much the same way. First, immediately after placing the article of clothing onto their body, the subject would double over and complain of intense pain as their organs began to shift and transform. After 2 minutes of this, they would lose the ability to speak, as well as the ability to stand upright on 2 legs. Their vocalizations would shift from human to animal, and external changes would begin to set in, regardless of whether or not the article of clothing was removed from their body. The front of the face would lengthen into a snout or muzzle, the arch of the foot would lengthen, and the tailbone would stretch as a tail formed. 3 minutes into the transformation, the subject displayed signs of extreme fatigue and pain. Next, the vomiting stage would set in, as the subject apparently shed all excess tissue and mass that would not be needed in their transformed state. Any mass that could not be expelled through the mouth would begin to deteriorate at an extreme rate, sloughing off the body and falling to the floor. By minute 5 of the process, the subject would almost perfectly resemble their new animal form, with the exception of a lack of body hair. Then it was time for the hair to sprout, disrupting the upper dermal layers and causing the violent expulsion of blood in the process. When the transformation was complete, the subject would appear calm, but this was a result of fatigue rather than disposition. Once researchers attempted to move the subject into a cage for transport, the animal would become incredibly aggressive and resistant to pain. Until sedated or terminated, attacks from the animal would not stop. Some recorded instances of aggression on the part of SCP-801 test subjects have included, but are not limited to, a rabbit that chewed through the Achilles tendon of a security guard, causing him to drop his weapon. The rabbit then made its way into the hall, where it charged at and subsequently bit through the shoe of a senior researcher, eating his big toe. The rabbit was apprehended when the other guard managed to administer a tranquilizer. Notably, the dose was far greater than the standard dose for a creature of its size, resembling the tranquilizer dose that would be administered to a horse. When the elk skin shoes were tested, the resulting elk managed to charge through the glass window separating the examination room from a room full of researchers, sending broken glass flying everywhere. The elk attempted to gore one of the researchers with its antlers, but was stopped with an elephant's dose of tranquilizer. The raccoon was quickly apprehended, as the test subject was tranquilized during the transformation process rather than after. However, when it woke up inside of its cage, it began to throw itself against the bars in an attempt to break free, until it had expired from its wounds. One sable that had resulted from testing with its corresponding coat avoided attacking researchers in an immediate fashion, instead running up the wall and into a nearby vent. It could be heard skittering through the ceiling for the next 20 minutes, until it was tracked to the site director's office, where it emerged and attempted to eat one of the site director's eyeballs. Thankfully, it was unsuccessful in this mission. One of the minks resulted from testing managed to bite off a portion of one researcher's buttocks before it was tranquilized and caged. The specific details have been redacted from the official file, but testing with the wolf fur coat resulted in the deaths of 4 personnel and nearly resulted in a 5th death before the intended victim was able to terminate the test subject herself. It should be noted that even after the animals had been contained, they continue to display unchecked aggression. If there is no one available to attack, the animals will turn this aggression on each other, or even themselves. As such, it has been officially recommended that all test subjects working with SCP-801 must be immediately terminated following testing and examination. Following human trials, the Foundation attempted to test the various articles on non-human subjects. This yielded mixed results, depending on the species of the test subject and the species of the article itself. For example, placing a raccoon inside of SCP-801-2 had no anomalous effect at all. All you get when you place a raccoon in a raccoon fur coat is a very annoyed, if very fashionable, raccoon. However, if the animals are a different species than that of the coat they are placed in, something else will occur. They will begin to transition normally for approximately 3 minutes before the process suddenly stops. These subjects are frequently left in a sorry state, with missing fur or limbs that have only partially transitioned. Most test subjects in these experiments did not survive the process. Those that did were promptly terminated on the orders of the Ethics Committee. The Foundation's experiments revealed that any attempts to transition a subject wearing multiple articles of SCP-801 at the same time resulted in the transition stopping earlier. This left the subject partially conscious, with partially transitioned limbs. These subjects were just as violent as those who had fully transitioned, and were recommended for immediate termination. Currently, all SCP-801 items are kept in a metal locker on Foundation ground. They may only be accessed for official approved testing,
which is open to any personnel with level 2 clearance and above. After any testing, the specific article of SCP-801 that was used must be dry cleaned. Aside from standard Foundation site security measures, no additional containment procedures are needed at this time. The exact cause of the aggression displayed by SCP-801's victims is still uncertain, but there are some potential explanations that have been floated by Foundation staff. Some suggested that the animals retain some understanding of their former human selves, and out of agony and rage over what they have lost, they act out violently until their lives come to an abrupt stop. Others suggest that it is a reaction to the mental and physical trauma of the transformation itself. A third, more vocal group, posits that it is a combination of the two. Unfortunately, there is no way to interview the transformed animal subjects, so the precise truth of their mental and emotional states post-transformation may remain a mystery forever. The origins of the garments themselves still remain a mystery as well. Out of an abundance of caution, the SCP Foundation has issued an organization-wide rule for its staff. Please refrain from wearing any fur garments while on duty. You just never know what might happen. The synthetic stuff may not be as elegant or warm, but at least you know it won't transform you into a beast. Probably.
Dr. Gears was having another boring day at the SCP Foundation, and that was exactly how he liked it. He treated himself to a cup of decaf black coffee. No cream, no sugar, a simple plain donut, and an apple. The breakfast of champions, to him at least. His duties today were ones he'd overseen so many times before. Watching his ever-rotating legion of subordinates shove various items into SCP-914 the Clockworks, just to see what on earth would happen. This machine had the ability to transmute matter in a variety of fashions, depending on the input selection, whether rough, coarse, one-to-one, fine, or even very fine. They tested everything, from Dr. Gears' watch to a chimp, which, as we all know, resulted in the beloved hyper-intelligent chimp scientist, Dr. Bobo. There were in fact such extensive testing records for SCP-914 that Dr. Gears had started taking an uncharacteristic hands-off approach to testing, as long as the researchers working under him were reasonably sure that the results of their testing wouldn't result in a containment breach, a fundamental alteration of consensus reality, or some massive loss of life. They could just go ahead with whatever dumb little experiment their heart desired. This, however, would turn out to be a way longer leash than Dr. Gears ever should have given to the kind of weirdos who work at the SCP Foundation. There had been certain, let's say, incidents in the past that have proved members of the SCP Foundation aren't above using anomalies inappropriately for their own personal enjoyment. There was, of course, the incident with SCP-662, the butler's handbell, and the supernatural butler it summons, Mr. Deeds. During the early stages of testing, Dr. Mirth, under the guise of experimentation, made Mr. Deeds make him tea, wash his car, cut his hair, and even do his laundry. Dr. Mirth was given a stern talking to by the O5 Council for this abuse of power. Good job, O5 Council. It's not like you ever use anomalies for your own benefit. Let's move on. Nothing to see here, folks. Speaking of people working for the Foundation using anomalies inappropriately, who could forget the extremely uncomfortable incident involving SCP-137, a real toy? This anomaly has the ability to become a real-life version of any toy brought into its vicinity, from the Masters of the Universe to Barbie in her dream house. But one researcher was hiding a horrifying secret. He was a brony. And that's why he sneaked a Twilight Sparkle toy into the testing chamber so he could have a conversation with his favorite My Little Pony character, which all in attendance agreed just had incredibly rancid vibes through and through. And that brings us back to today. Dr. Gears deciding to let his subordinate researchers throw pretty much anything into the Clockworks as long as it was unlikely to cause physical harm. And leaving this metaphorical door open allowed people like Dr. Siegel to step through. You see, while Dr. Siegel was considered by most to be an incredibly diligent and hardworking junior researcher, he did have one vice in his downtime. He was a card-carrying furry. And we're not just talking about a guy who watched Disney's Zootopia a few too many times. He had his own fursona. A wolf, if you were curious. I personally wasn't. He attended cons for fellow furries semi-frequently, and even had his own expensive, custom, high-end fursuit.
As such, there was one SCP he found particularly interesting, SCP-1471, also known as MalO version 1.0.0, an anomalous mobile app with some extremely strange properties. If you access it on an app store of your choice, you'll encounter an image of a strange, skull-headed canine creature with the following iconic description. MalO version 1.0.0 free. Reviews 0. Description: never settle for those awkward feelings of being alone ever again. MalO is an exciting and interactive experience that will keep you engaged and intrigued. The anxiety of social situations can be nerve-wracking, but after just a few hours of MalO, you will soon forget all about those painful emotions of disappointment. Be part of the new craze that is so quickly becoming the next social substitute. Remember, the more you participate, the more MalO will engage you. Your experience is completely up to you. Absolutely no ads. Enjoy. Dr. Siegel was certainly eager to forget all his painful emotions of disappointment and embrace the new social substitute. But he'd read all the documents and seen all the pictures on the file. Those who download the MalO app will be texted a series of photos, becoming closer to home over time, both literally and figuratively, which show the strange creature known as MalO getting closer and closer. For some, this would be a complete nightmare. For those inclined in the direction of Dr. Siegel, it would be a dream come true. There was only one issue. They were just pictures. But Dr. Siegel didn't get a job at the SCP Foundation by having a lack of intelligence. He'd very quickly figured out a potential solution to the digital barrier between him and his canine crush. He'd buy a burner phone, download the MalO app onto it, and put the resulting infected device directly into the Clockworks. It was one of the best ideas he'd ever had, in his own humble opinion. But of course, it would all be about selecting the right setting. On rough, the most likely result would be the phone itself just being transformed into a pile of broken glass, metal, and a variety of conflict minerals reduced to dust. On course, the result would likely be the metal chassis of the phone, the front glass panel, and a neatly arranged interior gutted from within. On 1-to-1, considering he'd bought a slightly older, cheaper model of Samsung's smartphone, he'd probably get the MalO app on an iPhone. And on fine, perhaps the best he could hope for was getting MalO version 2.0.0, which may have some minor improvement, like the pictures appearing twice as fast as they would with the normal app experience. Dr. Siegel knew that the only other option that could potentially bring MalO into the real world was the highly unpredictable, very fine option, which would either produce the desired result or cause something utterly horrifying to happen. But at the end of the day, Dr. Siegel thought to himself, isn't anything worth having also worth incurring a little risk? Who dares wins, after all, right? He downloaded the fateful app and made his way into the testing area for SCP-914. He'd booked the slot, so it was all official, but he still felt his heart racing as he put the infected phone into the input chamber. He set the control panel to very fine, exactly as planned, and activated the machine. Cogs twisted and churned, engines rumbled and sputtered, pipes wriggled and hissed. It was clear that something was going on here. When the process was complete and the output chamber opened with a billowing carpet of steam, Dr. Siegel could barely contain his excitement. He hoped that MalO would come strolling out of the smoke like Darth Vader in Star Wars: A New Hope, so you can only imagine his extreme disappointment when the chamber was completely empty. It didn't make sense. He thought everything through. How could the result possibly be so anticlimactic? This had gone from one of the most exciting days of his life to the most depressing. Dr. Siegel sighed and decided to call it quits, heading out of the test chamber, having no idea what he'd just unleashed onto the Foundation. Across the site, Dr. Alto Clef, one of the Foundation's most infamous researchers, was polishing his favorite shotgun in his office. He was whistling a cheerful tune to himself, just loving life, when he heard some strange rustling by the door. He turned around on his swivel chair just to make sure it wasn't Dr. Bright putting another bucket of battery acid on top of his door as a, quote, fun, harmless prank. Instead, he was shocked to see MalO, an actual, physical MalO, standing in his doorway, grinning. For a moment, Clef was too shocked to even react. This didn't make any kind of sense, but when MalO gave him a cheeky wink, he immediately loaded his shotgun and fired. blowing away a chunk of his own doorway. But sadly for him by that time, MalO had already darted away, intent on causing mischief elsewhere. Its favorite pastime. Dr. Clef was still wondering whether that rascal Dr. Bright was somehow behind this fiasco. But he was not, because he was actually about to become MalO's next victim in its ruthless reign of mild to moderate inconvenience. Dr. Bright was swanning around the break room with his favorite morning snack, a coffee with extra cream and a Danish from his favorite bakery in town. He was looking forward to enjoying these two simple pleasures in his otherwise incredibly stressful life, but little did the poor doctor know, tragedy was about to strike, and nothing would ever be the same. Just as the immortal doctor was about to disembark from the room, MalO appeared right in front of him, giving him the mild shock of his life. It was such a surprising occurrence, in fact, that he momentarily lost his grip on his coffee mug and his Danish, causing both to tumble to the ground. The mug shattered and the Danish splattered. By the time Dr. Bright looked up, MalO was already gone, just like his breakfast snack. Dr. Bright fell to his knees and screamed, "Why?" up to an indifferent break room ceiling. But MalO was just getting started. Dr. Kane Pathos Crow was on his way from his kennel, we mean his private quarters, to the soul extractor, when MalO suddenly manifested in front of him. This resulted in a brief barking match between the two for dominance over that particular hallway, which ended in MalO demanifesting to bother someone else, which technically made Dr. Crow the winner, though Crow himself resented ever being forced to act like a mere mutt. How, he began to wonder, had MalO escaped its app and begun to harass the real world? This would warrant further investigation. MalO continued its rampage of irritation across the site, intended to leave no stone of frustration unturned. And it wasn't just the Foundation staff it intended to freak out. It was just as eager to go and bother its fellow anomalies now that it had access to the meat space. Yes, that is a real term, we're not just being weird and gross, we promise. Over in the cell of SCP-173 the Sculpture, 3 members of D-Class personnel were cleaning up the homicidal creature's blood and poop. They were engaged in the standard procedure. One of them mopped, while the other 2 kept a close eye on SCP-173 to keep it frozen in place. That's when MalO popped into the cell behind them for a split second before disappearing, scaring the living hell out of all 3 of them. Though the fright was, of course, secondary to the fact that the second they looked away, SCP-173 snapped all 3 of their necks. Oops. May have gone a little too far on that one, eh, MalO? But this newly embodied burdensome beast was just getting started, friends. No anomaly was safe from its new antics. Next, it appeared in front of SCP-682's acid tank and made rude faces at the hateful creature from the other side of the glass. This only served to sour the creature's already utterly horrific mood. It thrashed around in the chamber, attempting to get out and perform an act of great violence. But by that time, MalO was already long gone, and SCP-682 was left grumbling in immense frustration. SCP-049 the Plague Doctor was having another very boring day. He'd been denied his animal cadaver test subjects for several days as a disciplinary measure after the latest incident, and as such, he was finding other ways to pass the time. Today, he was meticulously removing each piece of medical equipment, polishing them, and putting them in a neat line on his desk in his containment chamber. Scalpels, forceps, speculums, bone saws, all wonderful, shiny, and pristine. The Plague Doctor found it to be an incredibly calming activity, so, of course, MalO couldn't just let him be. The cantankerous canine, driven mad by the power of suddenly being able to interact with the world physically, manifested in the middle of the containment chamber and used its tail to knock all of the meticulously arranged medical equipment onto the ground with a thunderous clatter. The Plague Doctor, devastated, lifted both of his hands to his beak and yelled, "Sacre bleu!" in horror. In that same instant, MalO once again disappeared, leaving the tragic doctor to start from scratch. It was a serious setback on an otherwise lovely day. "Curse you, strange dog creature," he thought to himself while bending over to pick up the pieces. "Curse you and your entire bloodline." A group of hardcore Mobile Task Force members was engaged in the comically manly activity of playing poker while smoking in the barracks. And before you judge them for that, remember that if your job was as stressful as being a member of a Mobile Task Force, you'd probably smoke too. But their job was about to get a little more stressful when MalO suddenly materialized, and gave the poker table a sharp kick, sending the towers of poker chips and decks of cards all over the place, before disappearing without a trace yet again. It completely ruined their game. One of the more junior members asked, "Should we have done something about that?" A more senior operative shook his head and said, "We'll do something when we get the official call from up top. Until then, let's reshuffle the deck." In the Site 19 cafeteria, Dr. Agatha Wright was preparing to eat a delicious salad that she'd been waiting all day to enjoy. As we've often established, working at the SCP Foundation can be an immensely stressful job, so you need to take the small joys where you can get them. For Dr. Wright, this delicious premium salad that she'd bought from Harris Teeter earlier in that day was indeed a joy. She even got a fancy vinaigrette dressing for the occasion. Before she took the first bite, she noticed SCP-073 Kane approaching. Dr. Wright smiled and gave him a polite nod. Kane waved back. That, our dear viewers, is when tragedy struck. MalO suddenly manifested in front of Kane, propping out one of its canid legs right in front of where the hapless anomaly was walking. By the time Kane began to trip and fall over, MalO had already vanished, but it was too late. Kane kept falling forward until one of his metal hands landed right into the bowl that contained Dr. Wright's salad. Due to his anomalous abilities, the salad immediately withered away into nasty, dead nothingness. Dr. Wright began to cry as Kane, who felt profoundly guilty, tried his best to apologize. Truly, nobody in Site 19 was safe. MalO popped up behind Iris and ruined all of her photos. MalO popped up behind the immortal Hitler clone in his cell and gave him a good kick in the rear. MalO even popped up right behind SCP-343, also known as God, who smugly replied,
"I knew you were going to do that, my son."
Needless to say, it had been one hell of a day. Dr. Siegel, completely ignorant to the chaos his actions had caused around the site, had cried in the bathroom for 40 minutes out of sheer disappointment. He'd barely been able to focus on the rest of his duties for the day on account of being severely bummed out. This was a day he'd been looking forward to for so long, and it all had been for nothing. That evening, he was driving home on the highway, listening to sad songs on the radio, thinking about the fact he'd probably just crack open a beer and get some sleep when he got home. He sighed again and looked up to adjust his rearview mirror when he saw a skeletal face with huge white eyes staring at him in the reflection. A quick, almost reflexive turn revealed a huge black figure with a canine skull for a face was indeed just sitting in his back seat, watching him. It was so shocking that he immediately veered off the road and crashed his car into the concrete divider in the middle of the road, breaking his nose and collarbone in the process. Really a perfect cherry on top for this kind of day. Dr. Siegel was sitting in the hospital not long after that, with a cast around his upper body. This was also where he received a bouquet of flowers from Dr. Gears with an attached note saying he was put on 3-month disciplinary leave for the irresponsible use of SCP-914. Dr. Siegel looked up and saw that MalO was peering around the corner at him with its dead white eyes, its fang-lined maw twisted into a permanent, ominous grin. At this point, Dr. Siegel realized that being chased around constantly by a demonic skull-faced anomaly in real life wasn't nearly as whimsical as he expected it would be. In hindsight, that probably should have been obvious, shouldn't it? Though, please, let us know if you'd like MalO to stalk you in real life in the comments below, you bunch of weirdos.
The tiny carnivorous snowmen are relentless, sharp fangs dripping with blood as they crawl en masse towards the mobile task force, opening fire on them with their assault rifles. Who would have guessed that a mere hour or two earlier, a young boy was joyfully playing around in the snow here? How had things gone from frosty to freaky so fast? Let's rewind the clock. There was a chill in the air, that lingering, biting cold that would gnaw at your exposed skin if you dared to step outside in anything less than a thick, warm coat for protection. The ground was still coated in a heavy snowfall, a holdover from Christmas just past, weather that had refused to let up well into the early days of the new year. Everyone reaches an age where the cynicism of life, the weight of expectations that keep you anchored in the real world, they all coalesce to rob you of the childlike wonder of the snow. As you get older, the snow loses its novelty. It becomes a source of inconvenience, something that you need to shovel off the driveway to take your car out. Whereas, turn the clock back to youth, and it's like a tiny miracle. It coats your whole world in a clean blanket of freezing frost, turning the ordinary into a wonderland. Robert and Michaela Anderson were glad that their son Michael was still at an age where he could enjoy the snow. After all, Michaela getting to take her son out in his sled or seeing him hurling snowballs at Robert was able to provide them with a little bit of warmth during the freezing cold, snowier months in Missouri. Optimism was never enough to melt the snow, however, and maybe that's what drew in those creatures, the snowmen. It was early 2019, not even a full 2 weeks into the year. By now, Michael had gotten used to the fact that after Christmas and New Year's Day, a begrudging return to school would soon follow. As much as it clearly brought down his mood, nothing lifted his spirits like still getting to be out in the snow. And after a long day of helping his mom take down the tinsel and pack up the lights while his dad disposed of the tree, Michael was itching to go outside. "Please, Mom?" he begged as a box of decorations was placed back in the attic, his hands clasped together in a pleading gesture. "Please, please, please, just 5 minutes. I won't go further than the front yard." Michaela sighed, partly from exhaustion, but a smile crept onto her face. It was hard not to find her son's love for the snow endearing. "All right, but only for 5 minutes," she insisted firmly. "And I want to see gloves, hat, and a scarf, not just a coat, mister." With the speed and excitement that she and her husband had long since lost, she watched Michael race off to gather his warmest winter coat. "Remember when we were like that?" Robert heaved a sigh as he appeared from chopping up that dried-out, dehydrated remains of the Christmas tree. "No, do you?" Michaela replied with a light chuckle. Before long, Michael had donned his gloves and coat, almost a size too big. His scarf was almost wrapping up his entire head, save for the little bobble hat that poked out at the top. Robert opened up the front door, and his son stepped out into a world that had been whitewashed with clear, cold snow. Given that the Andersons lived on a small street in Grain Valley, there weren't many other people around, especially not with another flurry of snowfall moving closer in the clouds up above. But it wasn't the next snowfall that the residents of Grain Valley, Missouri should have been worrying about. It was the previous one, the one that had already fallen, and what was now hiding among the snow in the Anderson family's front yard. Having few other kids his own age to play with and not being allowed to venture too far from the front porch, Michael was content to spend his precious time outdoors making snow angels or practicing throwing snowballs. He had long been trying to get one to clear the roof of the small house he and his parents shared, leaving a few scattered patches of snow embedded on the roof shingles. A few meters from the front door stood a snowman. Granted, that was hardly a rare sight at this time of year, especially in the cold weather, but what was so unusual about it was that Michael hadn't remembered making a snowman recently. His parents hadn't let him out in the snow on his own since the start of the new year, given how badly the downfall and icy winds had been for the first week of January. Sure, somebody else could have made it, taking a pause as they passed by the Andersons' front yard, although not Michael nor either of his parents had spotted anyone doing that. The snowman itself was featureless, the white of its ice-cold body smeared with mud and dead leaves, debris that had been packed in with the snow used in its crude construction. It was featureless, too. Whoever had made it hadn't gone to the effort of giving it a face, nor draped an old scarf over it or given it a hat. It just stood there, but not like any other snowman. There was nothing welcoming about it. In fact, it was, fittingly, cold. Given how far away it stood, it was almost as if it was watching the house. Curiously, Michael began to approach the snowman. Being only 9 years old, his imagination was immediately running with the possibility that this snow and mulch construct could be alive, much akin to the likes of Frosty the Snowman. Little did young Michael Anderson know that he wasn't far away from the truth, although this particular snowman wasn't quite the happy, jolly soul from the much-covered holiday song. He hadn't got that much closer to the snowman when he heard something move nearer to where he stood. There was the rustle of leaves and the snapping of small twigs coming up from a bush next to him. Michael couldn't see what it was, but it was far too low to the ground and too close to the house for it to be a bird. Maybe a possum or raccoon had gotten trapped in the thin branches and was now scrambling to try and free itself. Diverting from approaching the snowman, he walked closer to the plant. As he did, the rustling got louder, more frantic, almost hungry. There wasn't just one creature lurking out of sight beneath the leaves, but lots of somethings. Robert and Michaela had been sitting indoors watching the TV when they heard a spine-chilling scream coming from outside. Instantly, they were both up on their feet, racing toward the front door. Robert threw it open, and Michael dashed inside in floods of fearful tears. "What happened, sweetie?" Michaela asked, concerned, brushing snowflakes from her son's coat. "Are you okay? Did you slip?" Through crying and sniffling, shaking uncontrollably with how afraid he was, Michael couldn't find the words to answer. Instead, he pointed through the still open door directly at the snowman, still standing at the edge of the front yard. "How long has that been there?" Robert wondered aloud, taking a single step outside. "Don't, Dad!" Michael screamed, but it was already too late. Something small and speedy had leaped out of the snow in the front yard and latched onto Robert's leg. He howled as he felt searing pain, bitten by rows of tiny pointed teeth, as sharp as needles and as bitterly cold as ice. Stumbling back, Robert Anderson fell over and landed on the floor in the front hallway, inadvertently carrying whatever had attacked him into his home. Both Michaela and Michael screamed in fear as the tiny creature clawed its way up Robert's leg while he swatted at it frantically, trying to brush it away before it could get closer. With a blind swipe of his hand, he knocked the creature to the floor and clambered to his feet, arms outstretched, keeping his wife and son behind him, while staring in disbelief at what had bitten him. It was barely more than half a meter tall, a tiny, white snowman. Bulbous, bloodied eyes bulged from its head, much like those of an insect. Directly between the eyes was a hole, a mouth not unlike a lamprey, lined with rows of sharp teeth that all pointed inwards. It reared up and lunged toward the Anderson family in a display of aggression that caused all three of them to jump, warily backing away from the snow creature. It was then that Robert and Michaela noticed what had frightened their son so much. Out of the corner of their eye, they both simultaneously caught the sight of the open front door and the yard beyond. Wriggling through the snow, shifting as they moved, were even more of the creatures, slithering towards the house like piranhas catching the scent of blood in the water. And standing ominously just beyond the driveway was the snowman, as if it was the general commanding its troops to storm the house. The Andersons raced upstairs as the swarm of snow creatures came spilling into the house, crawling from the yard onto the floor and piling on top of each other, like ants to climb the stairs. Naturally, Michaela's first instinct, as well as protecting her son, was to call the police. While Robert held the door to the bedroom shut, Michaela held Michael close and pleaded with the local Green Valley Police Department to come and help them. Although they only seemed to take the call seriously when Michael started screaming again. One of the snow creatures had pushed its way under the doorframe and was sneaking its way towards Robert to attack him, leaving a trail of water behind it. Stepping back and thinking fast, Robert grabbed a hairdryer and switched it on full blast. The sudden rush of electrically heated air caused the toothy snow creature to retreat into a corner. Refusing to let up, Robert got closer and kept the hairdryer trained on it, eventually causing the creature to melt until little more was left than a damp puddle. But the victory was momentary. There were still more of them crawling up the stairs after the Andersons. With their sharp teeth, they were gnawing at the wood of the bedroom door, trying to force their way inside. Fortunately for Robert, Michaela, and their son Michael, they wouldn't be able to recall the horrific events of January 12, 2019 for much longer. By the time the local police arrived, it had become clear to the officers responding that they were well out of their depth, especially when one of them was injured, suffering a bite from a snow creature. That was what led the SCP Foundation being called in, and within 15 minutes, they had dispatched mobile task force operatives to secure the anomaly. Being some of the Foundation's most highly trained agents, it didn't take long for the MTF to neutralize the carnivorous snow creatures. However, they quickly realized that the mysterious snowmen that had seemingly spawned the swarm could not be melted by any conventional means, nor would it deteriorate naturally on its own. A cover story was issued that Michael had suffered an accident and fallen down an open pothole that had become obscured by heavy snowfall. As a result, police officers were dispatched to help him, although the injury sustained by one officer due to a bite from a snow creature was never explained. Following this, the Anderson family was administered amnestics, meaning they quickly forgot about the whole terrifying ordeal. Maybe it was for the best, however. Young Michael seemed irreparably changed. He never went out to enjoy the snow again, repeatedly suffering from nightmares about the cold. Meanwhile, the anomalous snowman was recovered and thus designated as SCP-4409. Immediately, the SCP Foundation did as their organization does best and commenced testing. with a human subject, no less. They quickly discovered that SCP-4230 seemed to generate a sort of field around itself that could trigger a distinctive physiological change in any human being or animal that came within 6 meters of the Snowman. This process became known under the designation of SCP-4230-1. It appeared that Michael Anderson had managed to unknowingly escape this fate purely by not getting too close to SCP-4230, staying just far enough away so as not to trigger SCP-4230-1. The Foundation placed D-19375, a member of their D-Class personnel, within this 6-meter radius of the Snowman, and observed the gradual changes he underwent over the following week. For simplicity's sake, we'll refer to D-19375 as Frost, a rather fitting moniker, and you'll soon see why. Within a day of exposure to the Snowman, Frost complained to a senior researcher that he felt a lot colder than usual, although he exhibited no other observable symptoms beyond the coughing and sniffling of a common cold. By the following day, Frost was far worse for wear, appearing to have lost significant body mass to the point where he'd appeared to have been malnourished. His cold-like symptoms had continued, accompanied by disorienting dizziness, and as if all that wasn't bad enough, his skin tone had seemingly lost its natural pigment, reduced to an unnaturally pale shade, as white as snow. Day 3 saw Frost's body continue to change rapidly at an alarming rate. He was internally producing an unknown chemical that looked to be responsible for enacting certain alterations, namely the dissolving of his femur and fibula. The cold and dizziness were also now made all the worse by the addition of pain to the man's lower body. Frost even reported to Foundation researchers studying him that every movement he was able to make caused him to suffer extreme levels of physical pain. But yet, rather than attempt to cure his condition, the Foundation apathetically observed, noting down the process of SCP-4230-1. Within 5 days of exposure to SCP-4230, naturally occurring substances within Frost's body had traveled downwards and solidified. This was followed by the most shocking stage of the SCP-4230-1 process so far, and one that made the Foundation realize that these weren't just changes, it was a transformation. When Day 5 saw Frost's skeleton physically reshaping itself, his head becoming a sphere and his arms extending outwards like brittle twigs, it soon became clear what was happening to him. He was turning into a snowman. Rendered immobile and blind, a week after SCP-4230-1 began to take effect, Frost had started to secrete an unknown substance. This liquid lowered his body temperature, freezing almost instantly, and turning his skin into an icy white mass, worryingly similar to snow. Sure enough, on the 8th day, the extent of the SCP-4230-1 process was made evident. Frost had already perished, his body now looking identical to a plain, featureless snowman. No eyes or face, just a blank, cold slate. But underneath the outer layer of snow, Frost's bones and the rest of his organs were still contained inside. From the outside, though, he wasn't even human anymore. Just an instance of what became known as SCP-4230-A. However, being turned into another snowman by close proximity to SCP-4230 wasn't even the worst part. By now, you might be wondering, what were those snow creatures that attacked the Andersons? You'd be forgiven for thinking that perhaps these were rodents or other wild animals affected by SCP-4230-1. After all, testing has shown that the process doesn't just alter human physiology, but these carnivorous needle-toothed creatures are known as SCP-4230-Bs, and they are nasty little critters, to say the least. When a person or animal is turned into a snowman during SCP-4230-1, becoming one of these instances is far from the full extent of the transformation. The tests the Foundation conducted on Frost, and presumably on numerous other D-Class personnel as well, led to them discovering the further alterations made when someone becomes an SCP-4230-A instance. Their freezing, snow-encased bodies become hosts for white, spherical eggs. After a subject like Frost becomes an SCP-4230-A snowman, these eggs will hatch within 72 hours, producing up to 19 instances of SCP-4230-B creatures. The Foundation was quick to examine these bizarre snow spawn, gathering up as many as they could for testing. They found that instances of SCP-4230-B matured to adulthood remarkably quickly, reaching adulthood in 15 seconds.
Destroying the eggs containing these creatures seemed to be an effective way of preventing swarms of SCP-4230-Bs from getting loose, although the Snowman each egg came from would also have to be destroyed to achieve this result. Also, the lifespans of the smaller snow creatures only lasted for a total of 24 hours, and they would melt away after a full day of life, regardless of the surrounding temperature. SCP-4230-Bs seem uninterested in food that was presented to them. Specifically, one test involved giving a snow creature a head of lettuce and a watermelon. The creature regarded the fruit and vegetables with little interest, even refusing to eat either despite prompts from the researchers. This painted the SCP-4230-Bs as exclusive carnivores, which explained why they attacked the Anderson family. They were trying to eat them, hunting the Andersons as a pack. Further testing into SCP-4230-Bs revealed they had a weakness to heat above a temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit. During another test, a D-class was sent into a cell with 10 of the carnivorous snow creatures, armed only with a simple lighter, an emergency flare, and 1 gallon of gasoline. Immediately, all 10 of the SCP-4230-Bs crawled toward the man, hungry, and determined him to be a new source of food. That is, until they noticed the lighter he was carrying. The D-class frantically clicked the spark wheel until the flame danced from the lighter, causing 7 of the creatures to back away from the heat source cautiously. The D-class was able to kill the remaining 3 instances in self-defense, causing them to melt with little effort. He was far luckier than the subject of the next test would be. Another D-class was placed in a holding cell with 3 of the snow creatures, and much like before, they instantly acknowledged his presence and began approaching him. However, the Foundation had sent this member of D-Class in completely unarmed, without even so much as a match to defend himself. The carnivorous beasts made short work of their helpless victim, feeding on what was left. The Foundation was able to dispatch instances of SCP-4230-B with relative ease, even without waiting for them to simply melt after a day. The use of flamethrowers or drawing them into warmer areas seemed effective enough at destroying the small snowman that hatched out of SCP-4230-A bodies. However, some bright spark at the Foundation decided to test what would happen if the opposite element was used against SCP-4230-B creatures. Were they vulnerable to the snow despite being made from a snow-like substance themselves? Another test was conducted to answer this, which involved a small snowball being thrown at one of the SCP-4230-Bs. The result of that incident has been entirely expunged from the Foundation's archives, but it's a safe guess to ask why. Evidently, when attacked using snow or ice, SCP-4230-Bs are seemingly able to adapt in some way that is determined to their attacker. Do they add snow to their mass or become even more aggressive? It's hard to say given the redactions, but the result of that final test were deemed so catastrophic that the Foundation banned any further testing that involved SCP-4230-Bs. As for where SCP-4230 first came from, the Foundation is still baffled. The first reported incident involving the killer snowman and the carnivorous creatures it produced came when the Andersons found themselves under siege by hungry SCP-4230-Bs. Maybe the snowman is just a freak of nature, or the result of an unknown pathogen or microorganism carried in a snowstorm one fateful night. Or perhaps SCP-4230 is something far, far more vicious. Whatever the case, we would recommend waiting for the sun to come back out and the snow to melt, just to be safe. The day-to-day routine of Dr. Gears consisted of a few constants: piping hot cups of black, unsweetened coffee, plain dry wheat toast, the soothing sounds of his favorite white noise machine, and the endless carousel of experiments with SCP-914. Not that he was complaining. He was perfectly content to spend his time supervising one of the few anomalies he crossed paths with on a regular basis that was unlikely to kill or maim him in any way. Not that the Clockworks hadn't produced its fair share of unpredictable results over the years of extensive testing. It had definitely offered up more than a few surprises. And anyone who knew Dr. Gears knew that he was not especially fond of surprises. Dr. Bright had attempted to throw a surprise birthday party for the man once, but when he turned on the lights and fired the confetti cannon, all Dr. Gears did in response was give a deep sigh and say, "Really, Jack? You're making a spectacle of yourself."
Still, he had resigned himself long ago to the fact that supervising the experiments with SCP-914 meant witnessing some truly unpredictable outcomes. How could he forget the time researcher Blas tested an incandescent light bulb on the setting Very Fine, and the machine spat out an anthropomorphic humanoid light bulb that spoke in German-accented English and claimed to be Thomas Edison himself? This was, of course, impossible, as historical records surely would have indicated if Thomas Edison was a walking, talking light bulb rather than a human man. The imposter was eventually incinerated after its presence became too irritating to ignore. And then there was the time researcher Thompson filled out a Dungeons & Dragons character sheet and placed it into the machine on the setting Very Fine. The output produced was a sheet of paper promoting the previously non-existent tabletop role-playing game Fear in the Foundation. Whenever a person read the paper, they would suddenly find themselves in an out-of-body experience where they were inside the game's world, which contained several characters related to the SCP Foundation, as well as items and locations based on real-world counterparts. A subject in this state would only snap back to reality after winning or dying in the game. Researcher Jacobson rolled a 1 on stealth and saw SCP-096's face in the game, and was later found dead in the anomalous items storage wing. There was no shortage of Foundation staff trying to use the machine for personal gain, too. Dr. Naismith placed his credit card inside on the setting Very Fine, using it to produce a card covered in unidentified corporate insignias and reading, Rank Aleph Infinite Money Privileges. When Dr. Coltrane issued a written warning, Dr. Naismith took that warning and then placed it into the machine on the same setting, producing a piece of official documentation from the O5 Council in support of his infinite money privileges. Junior researcher Summers attempted to use SCP-914 in a misguided attempt at self-improvement, placing not an object, but herself in the intake booth before running the machine on the setting Very Fine. It cleared her skin, lengthened her hair, and improved her figure. This was, of course, in violation of several employee guidelines, and she was promptly dismissed after emerging from SCP-914. Dr. Veritas left a note in the experiment log following this incident, reading, By the time we realized what she was actually doing, it was too late to stop her. Needless to say, she's since been terminated, and I hope I don't need to tell you all not to do that again. And with that, the guideline was clear. No one was permitted to use SCP-914 for personal gain, or to change anything about themselves. Potential complications were too risky, not to mention the conflicts of interest that would be introduced into what should be an impartial research process. As scientific objectivity's biggest fan, Dr. Gears couldn't agree more. So as he settled in for the day's round of tests, he intended to keep a watchful eye on things and ensure that no funny business would take place. He didn't have much reason for concern, as his colleague Dr. Bonita prepped her research materials. She was working with 2 items, a small replica of Michelangelo's sculpture of David, and a sealed envelope containing something that was to be handled with extreme caution, a photograph of SCP-096's face. She planned to place the items inside on the Very Fine setting, in an attempt to see what result might be produced from combining an ideal of traditional beauty standards with the image of a creature that felt such profound shame and distress as its own appearance that it would destroy anyone who looked at its face. Like any good scientist, Dr. Bonita wanted to remove any unnecessary variables from her experiment. So as she placed her items inside the intake booth, she slowly, delicately unsealed the envelope. She wanted to put the picture inside by itself, without the extra element of the envelope potentially complicating things. Unfortunately, like Marie Curie's slowly, unintentionally poisoning herself with her own research materials, she didn't truly understand the danger of what she held in her hands. Just as she was setting the photograph down, her eyes flickered to the image. Before she could stop herself, before she could even look away or squeeze her eyes shut, she caught a glimpse of the one thing she should never look at, SCP-096's face. She gasped and slammed the photograph down, but she knew it was too late. The sound of an inhuman shriek coming from across the facility signaled that she was right. It was coming for her, and nothing in the world could stop it. In a containment cell on the other side of the facility, Foundation staff were horrified as they heard the telltale scream of an enraged SCP-096. The pale, thin creature, once huddled in the corner silently, had stretched to its full height of 2.38 meters and was screaming, sobbing, wailing, and gibberish, and beginning to tear its way out of its chamber. Guards tried their best to subdue the entity, firing their weapons at it, but the bullets did nothing to damage the creature's pale flesh or stop its movements. It ripped through the steel cube that contained it and knocked the guards out of its way with one swipe of its unnaturally long arms, sending them careening into a nearby wall. Fortunately for them, SCP-096 only knocked them unconscious. It didn't stop to harm them further, as it had a more important goal in mind: find the person who had seen its face and destroy them. As the alarm blared, signifying a high threat level containment breach, SCP-096 loped down the hall toward Dr. Bonita in SCP-914's room. Dr. Gears had not spotted Dr. Bonita's grave mistake and had no idea what had triggered the alarm he was hearing. He stepped away from the observation window, turning his attention to the crisis that was clearly happening somewhere else in the facility. Meanwhile, Dr. Bonita was panicking. She saw her life flash before her eyes, the certainty of impending doom that was coming for her, and coming fast, all because of one brief error in judgment. What could she do? There was nowhere to hide, no way she could run away fast enough, unless if she managed to lure 096 into the intake booth and start the machine while the creature was inside, maybe it would transform into something less intent on tearing her limb from limb. It was a risky move, and one that could jeopardize her position at the Foundation, but she couldn't very well keep her job if she was dead, so it seemed like it just might be worth a shot. A primal roar of agony and fury interrupted her thoughts, and she knew that SCP-096 was moments away from breaking down the door and getting its hands on her. She would have to move fast. With a screeching grind of metal on metal, SCP-096 wrenched the door off its hinges and barreled into the room in its search for the person who had seen its face. It ran toward the silhouette of Dr. Bonita standing just at the entrance to the intake booth. She tucked and rolled out of the way just as the monster entered the booth. The door automatically slid shut behind it, and as SCP-096 rattled the door and tried to free itself, she turned the knob to very fine with every ounce of strength and speed she had. There was a ding of a small bell, and the machine whirred to life as the objects inside were refined. Dr. Bonita had no idea what would be waiting for her in the output booth, but she could only hope that her last-ditch effort had managed to save her life. In the fog of panic, she briefly felt an itch of scientific curiosity, too. What would become of a being like SCP-096 in a machine as strange and wonderful as SCP-914? What would the addition of the statue do to it? As the door to the outtake booth slid open, steam poured out. It appeared her questions would soon be answered. Cautiously, in spite of herself, Dr. Bonita called out, "Hello?" No one answered, but she heard the sound of footsteps, slow and careful, as a figure emerged from the mist. She covered her mouth in shock, her eyes wide. "Dear God," she whispered in awe. Standing in front of her with pale, smooth skin and the same imposing stature was the most beautiful man she had ever seen. Wide, dark eyes shone under thick, sculpted eyebrows. Under the eyes, an aquiline nose, full, pouty lips, a strong, sharp jawline. His head was topped with a tangle of lustrous dark curls. It was the kind of hair she had only seen flowing in the wind on the covers of the romance novels she wanted desperately to buy, but was too embarrassed to be seen purchasing. His physique was, well, statuesque, like the build of the very Michelangelo sculpture she had placed into the machine just moments ago. There was no other way to say it. He was handsome, despite still being a little lanky and 9 feet tall. He peered at her curiously, towering over her in a way that had been terrifying in his former shape, but now made her heart skip a beat in an entirely different way. "Hi," was all she could think to say. Was she blushing? She shook her head, snapping herself out of it. She was a scientist, damn it, not some giddy schoolgirl passing notes in class. This was an incredible achievement, something she would need to study thoroughly, and she very much wanted to study him thoroughly. Nope, no time for that. She needed to write up a report, to inform her superiors, to try her best not to lose her job over this. She had to remain professional. "Hi." The man that had once been, or perhaps still was, SCP-096 spoke. "Oh, you can talk." Dr. Bonita laughed in surprise. The man's brow furrowed. His newfound ability to speak was a surprise to him too, it seemed. "Yes, I can. What happened to me?" he asked, stumbling over his words slightly, getting used to the feeling of them. "You ran into the machine." She gestured to SCP-914. "I'm not exactly sure, to be honest, but you're very different now." He nodded. "I feel different. I feel calm." He sighed, the relief plain on his face before a shadow of sadness fell over him. "I don't think I have to hurt anymore. I'm sorry for what I did before." Dr. Bonita did not know what to say. How do you respond when something you've been studying from afar, been horrified and fascinated by in equal measure, looks at you with a new, beautiful face and apologizes for all the harm it caused? This whole experience was so surreal that she might think she was dreaming if she didn't work at a place that was one long waking dream, or nightmare, depending on the day. Dr. Bonita, there's been a containment breach. Are you all right?" Dr. Gears had returned to the room, taking in the sight of the destruction left in 096's wake. "I'm fine," she called to him, and he followed her voice into the room, then stopped at the sight of the transformed anomaly. I don't have time for whatever this is. I trust you'll handle it." Dr. Gears took a long sip of his coffee, and taking Bonita's shocked silence as confirmation, had a leisurely stroll back to his office. A few moments later, the guards responsible for containing SCP-096 arrived on the scene, expecting to see carnage and find a docile SCP-096 crouched over a lifeless body. But instead, they found the same truly bizarre sight that Dr. Gears had shrugged off, and Dr. Bonita was still doing her best to process. They entered the room with their weapons drawn, but quickly lowered them, scratching their heads in confusion instead, before radioing their superiors and asking for further instructions. Responses from various Foundation staff who caught a glimpse of SCP-096's bold new look included, "Oh, would you look at that? Who's that guy? He's what?" And in the words of Dr. Jack Bright, "Oh no, he's hot!" Dr. Bright also proposed making the new SCP-096 a TikTok account and YouTube channel, seeking modeling representation for him, or selling a novelty calendar filled with pictures of 096 in various costumes. These would be, in his words, quote, "excellent ways to increase revenue for the Foundation." So really, you're the weird ones now for thinking my ideas are weird. Dr. Bright was asked to leave SCP-096 alone and stop trying to take his headshot. In the days that followed the incident with SCP-914, the SCP Foundation was at a loss about what to do with this new, seemingly harmless version of SCP-096. Dozens of D-Class were brought in to look at his face and see if the entity would still enter one of his rage states after a few days of getting used to his new form, but he never did. No screaming, no swallowing people whole, nothing more than a polite, if somewhat shy greeting and a courteous, "How are you doing today?" The D-Classes were relieved, but confused about being pulled from their cells just to stare at some random handsome man. Dr. Clef suggested dissecting SCP-096 to see what his new body looked like on the inside. This request was denied. Several interviews were conducted to evaluate SCP-096's mental and emotional state. Now that the anomaly was capable of coherent speech, it was much simpler to evaluate the potential threat level he might pose. Every researcher who spoke with him came to the same conclusion. Gone was the danger of the old SCP-096. He had not just become beautiful in a classical, superficial sense, but he had become beautiful on the inside as well. Interviewers reported a warm, friendly demeanor, a talent for engaging in conversation once he was made to feel comfortable, and a sincere interest in the thoughts, opinions, and feelings of those he spoke with. There was only one thing left to do: to make sure that SCP-096 had really changed from something deadly to something almost resembling an ordinary person. A photograph of SCP-096's face, of its original face, was removed from a secure vault by a D-Class. Then, the D-Class was sent into a room with SCP-096 and instructed to place the photograph on the table. SCP-096 looked down at what had once been his face, and his eyes filled with tears. A soft, broken sob left his lips, and he wrapped his arms around himself, hunching over as if in physical pain. Outside the room, guards prepared to handle things if 096 began to attack. Instead, he wiped his tears, took a deep, shuddering breath,
and looked at the D-Class with a somber expression. He picked up the photograph on the table and tore it in half as he finally summoned the strength to speak.
Please, get rid of these. That is not who I am anymore.
At Dr. Bonita's strong insistence, backed up by the conclusions of the research staff who interviewed SCP-096, a reevaluation of the entity's containment measure was ordered. It seemed cruel and unnecessary waste of resources to keep 096 trapped in a steel cube in its current form. He would be moved to a standard humanoid containment cell and treated as well as other safe-class anomalies, provided with books, films, food, and drink upon request, and, of course, other comforts. Of course, the O5 Council insisted on evaluating the entity before any of these changes could be approved. Dressed in a specially tailored suit provided by Dr. Bonita, SCP-096 appeared before the Council to present his case.
I know that I might not have the best record at the Foundation. I've done a lot of damage over the years, though, let's be honest, you all aren't exactly innocent either. Sorry, that was an attempt at a joke. I'm still very new to talking. All I can say is please consider giving me another chance to make a real life here, to make this place my home. Thank you for your time. What SCP-096 didn't know is that the O5 Council was so flabbergasted by the sight of his new face that they didn't retain a single word he said. They had all given their official approval before he even finished his short presentation. Before long, SCP-096 was moved out of his steel cube and into a new containment chamber that resembled a mid-range studio apartment, complete with a bed, a kitchenette, a television, and a table and chairs. He was provided access to all major streaming platforms, as well as a large stack of books to help him develop his grasp of culture and language after so very long being isolated from human society. Though he wasn't exactly human, he was determined to act like it. Word quickly spread around the Foundation site, and humans and anomalies alike flocked to SCP-096's new home to visit him and see the miraculous transformation for themselves. SCP-999 was the first to come and see the new and improved 096, chirping excitedly as it oozed into his room. He pet the slime gently, his face breaking into a warm smile as its euphoric effect washed over him. The slime became so excited at meeting this new friend, someone it had known as a source of sadness and hurt for so long, that it tackled him to the ground and tickled him for several minutes. 096 laughing uproariously all the while. SCP-343 stopped by to give 096 his blessing and wish him well in this new chapter of life. A few days later, SCP-507 popped back into the site and wanted to see the changes for himself. He was thoroughly impressed, though privately confessed to missing 096's more monstrous form, which reminded him of some of his favorite cryptids. There was one anomaly that was not thrilled with the appearance of SCP-096, however. SCP-056 was furious upon hearing about the new beautiful man that everyone just couldn't shut up about. It demanded a chance to speak to SCP-096 and to tell him that this place isn't big enough for the both of us. I'm the fairest one of all, you sniveling little worm. But the request was denied. SCP-056 sulked about it for several weeks. Meanwhile, Dr. Bonita was still intent on getting to know SCP-096 better. During previous testing with SCP-978, the Desire camera, a photo taken of SCP-096 revealed that his greatest desire was to disappear. Curious about the results would be now, Dr. Bonita received permission to take another picture of SCP-096. She snapped the photo while 096 was sitting in a chair in his new containment chamber, looking directly at the camera. When the photo developed, the result was simple. Everything in the picture was exactly the same with one exception. Dr. Bonita was pictured sitting next to 096, her hand clasped in his. Both were smiling soft, contented smiles. When she showed him the photograph, he smiled at her and shook his head. It really is an amazing camera. She flushed. Doctor, before you go, could I ask your name? Dr. Bonita smiled and nodded. It's Isabel. What should I call you? SCP-096 paused thoughtfully for a moment. He was giving himself a name for the very first time, allowing himself an identity other than a strange, hollow, pale thing that existed to cry and suffer and hurt. Finally, he answered her. Call me David. Did you ever have to perform a dissection in school? Maybe you had to carve up a fetal pig, or slice into a frog while nightmarish visions of Kermit and a widowed Miss Piggy danced in your head. Though it's rarely a pleasant experience, unless your tastes are on the morbid side, Most biology teachers would agree that the best way to learn how something works is to take it apart. As distasteful as it can be to hold a frog's tiny liver in your hands, it definitely does give you a better sense of the pieces that make up the complete creature. But what if there was an easier way to look at the individual parts of a living being? What if you could take it apart without ever having to prep a scalpel or stain your hands with the blood of innocent frogs? Like most of the seemingly impossible things in our world, the SCP Foundation discovered something that allows its users to do just that. In fact, it can handle a lot more than just a frog, and its applications go far beyond the confines of a high school science lab. SCP-291 is a small, plain steel building with a large door on one side. The door has no handle or knob and functions similarly to a garage door. The door cannot be pried open by any ordinary means, and the inside of SCP-291 can only be accessed if the structure is connected to a suitable power source. Once a power source has been connected, the door races and exposes a room inside. It is small, about 4 by 2 meters. It contains a console board, a large screen, and a plexiglass container resembling a coffin. How very sinister. The coffin is large enough to contain a human under 7 feet tall. So sorry, Ferdinand the Cannibal, you're going to need to sit this one out. The coffin sits on a conveyor belt with several tubes connected to the wall above it. On the opposite side of the room, there are holes of varying sizes, each containing a small door that can be opened or closed. Because initial observation indicated that SCP-291 was intended for some kind of human testing, a D-class test subject was selected for experimentation. The subject was instructed to lie down in the coffin and wait to see what would happen next. The display screen lit up, depicting a grid-lined image of the test subject. Buttons along the console board adjusted the image, showing the skin, muscles, and organ systems of the person in the coffin. There were no words or numbers on the screen, and all of the buttons appeared to have only 2 settings: on and off. When one of the researchers pressed the first button on the console, the tubes above the coffin began pouring a blue liquid into it. The test subject reacted with confusion, but did not experience any adverse effects. They quickly lost consciousness, indicating that the liquid was some sort of sedative. The liquid continued to pour into the coffin until the vessel was completely filled, at which point it congealed into a thick gel. The test subject's breathing and heartbeat slowed to a stop, and the conveyor belt suddenly creaked to life. The coffin was carried, test subject inside, through a small door that immediately locked behind it. The small room was filled with the sounds of gears turning, machinery clinking, and motors whirring. The display screen was taken over by a large rectangle, resembling a traditional loading screen. After 30 minutes, the process was complete, and the back door of the room unlocked itself. When the researcher walked through the back door, they found another room with a conveyor belt and a row of 24 lockers. Each locker was opened, one at a time, and its contents removed for examination. Inside each, the research team found a different portion of the test subject's body, in a block of some unidentified clear substance. The body was divided in the lockers into these separate parts: brain, lungs, and diaphragm, heart, digestive system, reproductive organs, left eye, right eye, upper left torso and arm, upper right torso and arm, lower left torso and upper leg, lower right torso and upper leg, lower left leg and foot, lower right leg and foot, lower left arm and hand, lower right arm and hand, neck and head, upper skeletal system, lower skeletal system, lymphatic and circulatory system, and skin. Phew, the miracle of the human body, right? Boundless in its fascinating complexities. Each block of body parts was placed back in its designated locker, and the second button on the console was pressed. At this point, the doors to the organ lockers sealed themselves shut, and the sound of the machinery working filled the small space once again. This continued for a duration of approximately 45 minutes. When the machinery went silent, a new plexiglass coffin emerged into the main room, with the test subject inside. He looked identical to how he had looked at the start of the experiment, with no evidence that he had previously been disassembled. The blue liquid slowly evaporated from the container, and the test subject opened his eyes. The lead researcher conducted an immediate interview with the reassembled subject, who reported no memory of the process after initial exposure to the blue liquid. They insisted that the process had been like a good night's sleep, which honestly makes us pretty eager to take it for a spin.
A medical examination determined that there were only a few changes to the test subject during the disassembly and reassembly. When they returned to consciousness, the test subject's stomach was empty, they were naked, and all of their hair was gone. With this new understanding of SCP-291's anomalous properties, the Foundation decided to continue their experimentation. With each new test, the experiments became more creative and, unsurprisingly, more depraved. First, a D-class subject was placed in the coffin and disassembled. Then, instead of placing the various body parts in their designated lockers, the vital organs were removed from their storage before reassembly was attempted. This resulted in the equipment shutting down completely. A researcher pressed the third button, which forced a hard reset of the entire process, causing all of the blocks of body parts to eject via an exit hatch. During the next experiment, non-vital organs were removed before the subject's body was reassembled. The appendix and gallbladder were left out, and when the subject regained consciousness, these organs were still gone. However, there was no visible damage or scar tissue in their place. They were simply gone, as if they have never been there in the first place. So, if body parts could be removed from a test subject, could new body parts be added? Could existing body parts be replaced with different ones? A D-class subject in need of a skin graft following a flamethrower-based accident was placed in SCP-291. Once taken apart, a portion of healthy skin donated by another, somewhat unwilling D-class subject was placed in the locker, along with the skin already present there. Once the subject was put back together, the healthy skin had replaced the damaged skin with no adverse effects. Repeat attempts at this test showed that it was effective for limb transplants, heart transplants, and kidney transplants with a 0% failure rate across all tests. After determining that SCP-291 could be used for an untold amount of good, making organ donations easier and safer than ever, the Foundation naturally had to pivot to something more useless, but interesting and likely horrifying. After all, it's not like they could ever just make anomalous technology available to the public, right? 2 D-class subjects, 1 man and 1 woman, were disassembled by SCP-291. The brains of the test subjects were swapped, and then they were reassembled. When they awoke, the subjects had the personalities and memories of the brain placed in their body. In a turn of events previously only seen in blockbuster comedies like Freaky Friday and the live-action Scooby-Doo movie, seminal piece of cinema, the subjects had swapped bodies. They were subsequently disassembled, their request to look at their new bodies naked having been swiftly denied, and the brains were returned to their rightful bodies. After the experiment was finished, the subjects appeared mostly normal. However, they did complain of disorientation as well as mental and physical discomfort over the next several days. After going through 2 brain transplants in 1 day, though, that's really the least you can expect. After perfecting the practice of swapping body parts between different human subjects, the ghoulishly curious research team decided to take things in an interspecies direction. A variety of test subjects, including cats, dogs, lizards, fish, mice, and, of course, humans, were selected for this next round of experiments. 20 tests were performed using these new subjects, and only 3 of the experiments were successful in transferring body parts from an animal of one species to another animal of a different one. Attempts to swap body parts between mammals and reptiles or fish proved disastrous. When a fish and a human were both disassembled and the fish's gills were placed with the human's body parts, neither creature survived the reassembly process. The human awoke with a new set of gills embedded in their neck and immediately began gasping for the oxygen they could not take in. Within minutes, they had suffocated. The fish's fate was even worse. It did not reassemble so much as it became a pile of goo, scales, and 2 floating eyeballs. Experimentation with a human and a lizard yielded similar results, turning the lizard into a puddle of organic matter and killing the human test subject after only a few minutes. As disastrous as the failed cross-species tests were, the successful ones were almost as bad. Trial 001 involved a cat and a human. Not wanting to attempt too much at once, the research team opted to just swap out 1 organ, the left eye. Both subjects survived the transfer and were able to use their new eye. The human subject reported full use of the cat's eye, with improved night vision in addition to trouble seeing color. The cat did not enjoy its new eye nearly as much as the human subject, and had clawed its human eye out of its head by the end of the following week. In Trial 007, a successful brain transfer was performed between an adult human man and an English Mastiff. The man in the Mastiff's body expressed discomfort with walking on all fours and asked to be returned to his body as soon as possible. The Mastiff in the man's body adjusted to bipedal locomotion in a few hours, but was disassembled after urinating on a researcher's shoes. The final successful trial, and the most unnerving, was Trial 016. A female D-class test subject's reproductive organs were swapped with those of a pregnant Labrador retriever. An ultrasound conducted after the transfer indicated that the Labrador fetuses survived the procedure and could conceivably be carried to term by the human subject. Several members of the research team began to take bets on whether or not she would end up giving birth to puppies, but the transfer was reversed within the day, so we'll never know what exactly would have happened. Perhaps that's for the best. Personally, we hope the Foundation's Ethics Committee gives some of these scientists a very stern talking to about their behavior on this one. When not in use for testing, SCP-291 is to be disconnected from any power sources. At least 2 personnel are positioned outside of its containment at all times, standing guard, and these personnel must be swapped out every week. When it is not connected to any power sources, SCP-291 is considered harmless, though it should still be treated with caution. The main entryway remains closed and locked when there is no available power source, but the door can be opened manually from the inside in the event of an emergency. Any disassembled organisms are stored in a locker in the containment facility, labeled with a Sharpie marker in order to keep track of what specimens are stored there. Whether this is the same Sharpie used to label food in the break room fridge is unknown, but just like Dr. DiRamiro's ham sandwich, it's best to leave these items untouched. Any personnel found to be responsible for missing specimens will be transferred to another project and receive a strongly worded email.
Panic and terror gripped everyone in the Foundation facility. Well, everyone who was still alive, that is. Guards were working tirelessly to fight back and regain control of the building, but they didn't have enough bullets to suppress the oncoming horde. Somehow, a sample of SCP-008 that was being examined for testing purposes had managed to spread to one of the research staff. Before long, the very same researcher was now a mindless zombie, a reanimated corpse that had managed to bite several other staff members, spreading the infection. It didn't matter that this original carrier was shot down by security personnel. It had already done its damage and passed on SCP-008. By now, there were too many of them to simply bonk each one on the head and neutralize it. The Foundation facility had gone into full-scale lockdown, an emergency quarantine to try and limit the spread of the deadly virus. Any exit to the outside world was shut and would stay sealed tight until someone from the Foundation could do something. But that meant the few surviving members of staff trapped inside were at the mercy of the zombie horde. Their options were limited. SCP-500 was known to perfectly cure those infected with SCP-008, but with all exits locked, it was impossible to get any of the remaining SCP-500 pills on site. Then one of the surviving researchers, one Dr. Omel, had an idea. It was an insanely risky plan, one that the Foundation would never sign off on, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Gathering up the remaining security forces that hadn't been infected with SCP-008, along with a research assistant that had managed to escape the zombies, Dr. Omel and his band of survivors headed deeper into the facility. While the external doors were all locked to prevent the SCP-008 infectees from making it out and spreading the virus to the wider world, the doors inside the facility were all still functioning, and it was a good thing too. Dr. Omel's plan relied on opening the doors to 2 anomalies: SCP-914 the Clockworks, a machine capable of destroying or refining anything placed inside of it, and SCP-049, the Plague Doctor. It was a shot in the dark at best. Omel had observed the Plague Doctor for some time, and knew that the beak-faced surgeon was capable of creating zombie-like creatures known as SCP-049-2. Not dissimilar from the zombies infected with SCP-008. If anyone could potentially fix this nightmare, there were few as well versed in anomalous medicine as SCP-049. Taking him to the Clockworks was, however, an even bigger risk. Normally, SCP-049 killed any he touched, and turned their deceased bodies into SCP-049-2s, hence Dr. O'Mel calling for a refinement of the Plague Doctor's abilities. Placing him in the input booth of SCP-914 and setting it to very fine, O'Mel prayed he'd made the right call. He could hear the horde of SCP-008 pounding outside the locked door. What emerged from the Clockworks was still recognizable as SCP-049, retaining his beaked mask, although the mask itself was actually flesh and bone, a part of his skull. His robes now flowed out behind him as a pair of dark, feathery wings, giving him an even more bird-like appearance. Despite this, SCP-049 had claimed that he'd never been a bird before. "I'll admit, I didn't expect wings," the surviving assistant remarked. "That's not so surprising, really," Dr. O'Mel admitted. "He did lay an egg that one time."
He did what?
Before an explanation could be given, the SCP-008 zombies managed to break down the door and came flooding into the room. O'Mel recoiled in horror as they snarled and shuffled closer, reaching towards him with decrepit fingers. Suddenly, SCP-049 swooped into the path of the encroaching undead with a flap of his new wings. Calmly, he gave a gentle move of his hand, like lifting something from a shelf. A bizarre contraption appeared around his forearm, a gauntlet connected to syringes that were strapped to each of his fingers, all filled with various different fluids. Dr. O'Mel was amazed. SCP-049 seemed to now have the anomalous ability to summon surgical equipment from a tiny pocket dimension. It was almost exactly like how SCP-076-2 Abel drew his weapons. Reaching towards the nearest SCP-008 zombie, still moving with the utmost calm, SCP-049 stated, "Now try to hold still." He spoke in a gentle voice, with a bedside manner most medical doctors would be incapable of. "This might sting a little." With that, SCP-049 pushed the syringes into the zombie, the fluids draining from each one, then refilling as he withdrew his hand. The SCP-008 instance froze for a moment, almost like it was confused before it began to emit what looked to be steam, as though it had stepped out of a hot shower, shaking uncontrollably. The necrosis and telltale signs of infection seemed to disappear, like being washed away until all that was left of the SCP-008 zombie was the infected researcher it had been before. The man was alive and well, much to Dr. O'Mel's astonishment. SCP-049 hadn't just cured the SCP-008 infection, he'd actually reversed it, leaving the infectee alive and well. It took a few hours for SCP-049 to fly around the facility on his new wings, effortlessly turning all the SCP-008 zombies back into their old selves one by one. By the time he was done, everyone on site that had previously been exposed to SCP-008 was cured, and it didn't stop there. The Foundation still mandated everyone who was previously infected to remain in quarantine whilst they were examined, demanding the now refined SCP-049 to remain in his cell, which he politely complied with. When the SCP Foundation doctors took a look at the formerly zombified staff, they were amazed at what they found. Each one had all traces of SCP-008 completely removed from their systems. Trying to re-expose them to the virus, their bodies now seemed to be able to generate anomalous antibodies that rejected and fought off infection by SCP-008 in a matter of seconds. The Plague Doctor had made everyone immune. Upon further testing, examining skin and blood cells from the former infectees, and performing full top-to-bottom health checks, the Foundation doctors learned something else too. Everyone that SCP-049 had cured was even healthier than they had been before. One security guard had been a one-pack-a-day smoker for 10 years, but an X-ray revealed any damage to his lungs, mouth, and throat had all been completely reversed. On every possible internal and external level, the formerly zombified personnel had all been returned to pristine health by SCP-049. Eager to witness the full extent of these new anomalous abilities the Clockworks had given him, the SCP Foundation struck a deal with SCP-049. If he performed a mission for them, then they would provide him with the means to have anything he wanted. For a moment, the Plague Doctor pondered their terms, and then agreed. "What is it you want in return?" Dr. O'Mel had asked. "To cure the world, Doctor," SCP-049 replied simply. The Plague Doctor flew as fast as his wings would carry him to the location the Foundation had given him. It was an isolated region in Siberia, kept completely cut off from the rest of the world by guards working around the clock. Arriving at the edge of the frozen town, SCP-049 was approached by the security commander and given his full directive from the Foundation. Your objective, I'm told, is simple. You enter the restricted area and neutralize anything you come into contact with. When you're done, return here, and we'll report the results to command. Thank you, Commander. The Plague Doctor nodded graciously. You have been most helpful. He didn't ask what was out there, merely turned and began walking through the snow until he could no longer be seen by the eye. Maybe he had already sensed what was out there, what kind of sickness plagued this place, and understood exactly what the Foundation were asking him to do. If SCP-049 had any questions, he did not make them known. Instead, he just headed off in search of every instance of SCP-610 he could find. There was quiet for an uncomfortably long while. The personnel standing guard at the edge of the area watched through the snowfall, ready if anything started slithering its way towards them. The Foundation's security all tensed when the motion sensor picked up movement, accompanied by the sounds of fighting and the bizarre inhuman noises from instances of SCP-610. Then, after another long period of unsettling quiet, somebody spotted a gently glowing light making its way through the snow. As it drew closer, the glow of a burning makeshift torch made it clear that the figure holding it was SCP-049. And as he made his way towards the rendezvous point, it quickly became apparent he wasn't alone. Shivering in the freezing cold and wet from the snow, covered in scraps of dirty clothing and whatever else they could find, was a huddled mass of people. All of them looked bewildered, following the light of SCP-049's torch like a guiding beacon towards the edge of the perimeter. The Foundation security all stood slack-jawed in amazement at what happened, while the Plague Doctor led the people and urged the commander that they all needed warmer clothing immediately. He had done it. SCP-049 had cured the flesh that hates. In the coming months, the Foundation soon found themselves very busy. Everyone who had previously been infected by SCP-610 needed to be screened and examined, just to make absolutely sure there was no chance they could mutate into a fleshy monstrosity again. But just like before with the former SCP-008 zombies, these people were in perfect condition, cured and healthier than they had ever been. By using his new anomalous surgical skill and healing power, SCP-049 had returned the flesh that hates victims back into human beings. It was starting to seem like there was no disease, no infection, anomalous or otherwise, that he could not cure. The Foundation began an effort to rehouse the former SCP-610 infectees. Given that most of them had spent years as aggressive, anomalous abominations, almost every one of them had officially been pronounced dead and couldn't just go back to their old lives. The SCP Foundation gradually reintroduced them into the world, setting up new identities and integrating them into new countries. SCP-049 even personally helped console some of those that struggled with the adjustment, offering to give them therapy to aid in the process. He was more than just a plague doctor, it seemed, thanks to the Clockworks. SCP-049's good work didn't stop with curing the flesh that hates either. As promised, the Foundation allowed him to carry out his newfound purpose. Whereas before he was obsessed with eradicating what he called the pestilence, now the Plague Doctor seemed to be directing all of his focus to curing the world, as he put it. And he started with some of his fellow anomalies. The Plague Doctor started experimenting with his new tools, concocting cures and serums aplenty, by pulling whatever he needed from an endless supply of equipment and ingredients at his fingertips. He developed a cure for the condition that caused Daniel McIntyre to become SCP-2800 Cactusman. His skin reverted back to normal, no longer sporting spines, while the plant-like parts of his DNA once again became human. SCP-049 even offered a sympathetic ear to a lot of Daniel's troubles, giving him therapy through a lot of his mental health difficulties. SCP-2102 was also one of SCP-049's successful patients. His condition of rapidly overproducing new skin tissue when injured quickly became a thing of the past. Then the Plague Doctor turned his sights to the wider world, working tirelessly to create new vaccinations and treatments for diseases that were once thought to be incurable. Everything he made and had the Foundation distribute to those that needed it was all 100% effective. People were healthier and happier than ever, all thanks to the Plague Doctor. Until they weren't. In attempting to eradicate disease the world over, a new strain of illness emerged. SCP-049 took to calling it a new pestilence, and it was nothing short of horrific. It would have been considered anomalous at one time, but it quickly became so widespread that it couldn't be contained. All the Plague Doctor's advanced medical treatments had encouraged this disease to mutate, to adapt against everything he could throw at it. It could infect any person at any time and present itself with virtually any symptoms. It resisted drugs, any form of treatment, and it spread rapidly. Eventually, while trying to come up with a way to protect people from this strain of superbacteria, this new pestilence, SCP-049 started to fall ill. He had caught it, and even with his refinement, he was beginning to weaken. The Plague Doctor was dying, and once he was gone, the whole world would soon follow as more and more people caught the sickness. There was only one thing he could do, a way to leave someone behind to carry on his work. When the Foundation, those that weren't yet ill, found SCP-049, he had already passed. But alongside his body was something smooth and pearlescent, an egg, and inside, maybe a chance for the world to be cured.
Roll up, step right this way, ladies and gentlemen. On the other side of these canvas doors, you're about to witness something so monstrous, so hideous, so repulsive, that it will turn your stomachs and fill you with amazement. The creature you'll find in this tent has been known to elicit all manner of responses from well-to-do folks like yourselves. You may want to laugh at it, you may want to strike it down, you may even want to throw rotten fruit at it. And believe you me, we are prepared for that. You will find all manner of rotten tomatoes, eggs, and other festering foods that are begging to be pelted for the low price of 5 cents per handful. If you follow me through these doors and gather around this cage quietly, perhaps you will see it. Wait for your eyes to adjust to the dark and hold your revulsion until you cannot bear it anymore. Only then will we get to look at the papery gray skin sagging loose over a swollen gut. Marvel at its tree-trunk legs, barely strong enough to support its own weight, its deformed trunk that hangs limp off the front of its face, and its ridiculous ears that flap nervously when it's afraid. Don't be afraid of the tusks sticking out from its face or its cries of pain and anguish. Instead, hold your tongues and wait. For if you're patient enough, and perhaps with a slight beating, it may even play us a song with the valves on its trunk. Then, and only then, you're permitted to pelt the Elephant Man with whatever you see fit, as you bask in the glory of Herman Fuller's Circus of the Disquieting.
Reese Freeman didn't have much of a choice but to join the circus at the age of 14. The cast-out son of a freed slave in New Orleans, he spent much of his early life wandering the streets, trying not to get into any trouble. In the late 1800s, very few places were interested in hiring a young black man, unless, of course, they were looking to turn him back to the life that his father had fought so hard to escape. That's why when Reese was out fishing one afternoon and saw a big red tent going up on the outskirts of town, he couldn't help but wander over. Much to his surprise, a group of black men were the ones raising the marquee. They didn't look like slaves either. Reese had never heard of a circus. The closest he'd ever come to seeing was a traveling entertainment cart that would sometimes pop up around town with a dancing bear in a cage, or a glass ball and a pack of tarot cards. The brightly colored tents that went up one after another were enough to draw a crowd. Even the most well-respected in New Orleans came out for a look. Standing ankle-deep in the river, Reese peered over at the man who came out to address the throng. Dressed in a long tailcoat with a tall top hat, the man stood on a box of fruit and waved a cane dramatically in the air.
Good folks of New Orleans! What you're about to witness tonight has never before been seen this side of the Mississippi. Wonders and amazement galore, spectacle and intrigue, mystery and mayhem, and just a touch of the impossible. I go by the name of Herman Fuller, the most talented and notorious circus master in the entire United States. The dazzling array of shows that I've brought before you is not for the faint of heart or the weak of constitution. Your stomachs will be turned and your minds may be altered, but it promises to be a night that you will never forget.
Reese wasn't much interested in any of what he had just said. This kind of two-penny show was reserved for the folks who had the money to throw around on needless things like smiling and having a nice evening. What Reese was far more interested in were the groups of men working behind the scenes, pulling various carts and setting up all of the stalls. A lot of them didn't look much older than him. A grin spread across his face. SCP-4409 insisted on being interviewed in the dark. With all the lights in the interview chamber switched off, Dr. Simon Crossley entered the room and sat down across from the Elephant Man. Even in the dim light, though, he was able to still make out part of the man's features: the ivory tusks, the hanging nose, and the nervously twitching ears. The man had been picked up in St. Louis, where local police had found him panhandling in the streets. While he certainly seemed harmless enough, it was important for the Foundation to take him in just to be sure. Sitting in the dark interview room, Reese Freeman was apprehensive at first about telling his side of the story. A life of being mocked, spat on, and chased out of towns had left him with a real distrust of other people. That was probably made worse by his apprehension at being put in another cage within the Foundation. He told Dr. Crossley that he was born as normal as could be, that his current ghastly affliction was something done to him quite some time ago, but as much as it pained him to recollect, it was a tale that he knew he'd probably have to tell. Dr. Crossley replied that he was all ears. It took Dr. Crossley a few seconds to realize his faux pas. SCP-4409 glared at him before continuing to explain how he was made the way he was. Reese Freeman had managed to land a job with the circus surprisingly easily, despite having no previous experience and no references to back him up. Herman Fuller took a shine to him. It was menial work, and not many folks were up to doing it, but since Reese had never had a job before, he didn't know any better. He started out at the bottom of the ladder, scraping out feces, washing down old cages, and carrying heavy crates. The once scrawny 14-year-old boy quickly turned into a stocky 17-year-old with broad shoulders and strong legs. They would travel from town to town across most of the United States, stopping off in major cities for weeks at a time to bring in as much money as possible before moving on. Reese didn't save much of that money, but he didn't mind. The fact that he got 2 meals a day and something to do with himself was enough. In fact, he kind of enjoyed sleeping on top of the carts as the horses pulled them across the dusty American roads. The one thing that always seemed to affect him, though, was that he was never allowed to actually see inside the tents. He would see folks come and go through the canvas doors week after week, but was never allowed so much as a peek inside himself. The older guys were responsible for throwing the canvas sheets over the cages, which would remain that way as they traveled. Not having seen much of the world at that point, Reese didn't have much of an idea of what could be in those cages. Perhaps some kind of animal from a foreign country, something from Africa or Asia. They made all kinds of noise. Reese said that most of them sounded like humans, but then they'd go and make strange animal sounds that no human mouth could ever produce. One night, his curiosity got the better of him. Hanging back before the crowds got into the tent, he sidestepped over to the entrance, making sure that no one saw him, and took a peek through the doorway. It was dark inside, too dark to make out much of what was happening. The crowd of people was standing between him and the cage, all jostling and leaning this way and that, trying to make out whatever it was that was inside. A screeching sound filled the air, making the whole crowd and Reese outside jump right. Standing on his tiptoes, he tried his best to see what was moving around in that cage. It seemed to be moving around like a person, lurching this way and that, but the sounds coming from it sounded more like a bird. And sure enough, after a moment, a huge pair of disproportionately ugly wings stretched out from either side of the creature, flapping and sending a rush of air through the tent so powerful that it blew the flap wide open in front of him, just as Herman Fuller turned around to see him standing there. Reese bolted and hid behind one of the carts. He was going to be in trouble for this. He was sure of it. It was one of Fuller's only rules of the circus, and he had just gone and broken it. He was in the hottest water imaginable. But as nighttime fell and the dregs of the spectators wandered out of the tent, Fuller seemed to be in too bad a mood at all. Watching him from a distance, Reese got the impression that he might not actually be in as much trouble as he thought. Fuller caught his eye and came over, cane twirling and top hat sitting jauntily atop his head. Reese got off on the wrong foot, apologizing right away for spying into the tent. The circus master just laughed it off and slapped him on the back.
Reese, my boy, don't worry about it. I've got much bigger plans for you. Much, much bigger.
That night, as Reese lay in bed,
He had a terrible dream about what he had seen in the tent that day. Circus of the Disquieting was certainly an apt title for this place. The image of that strange, shadowy bird person in the cage haunted his nightmares until suddenly, 2 pairs of strong hands gripped him and ripped him out of his sleep. He knew better than to fight back. This was surely going to be his comeuppance for breaking Fuller's rules earlier. They dragged him into the main tent where there was an oil lamp in the middle, illuminating what looked like a heavy wooden operating table. His wrists and ankles were strapped in, and then the 2 men left him alone. He had half a mind to scream, but with all the caged-up creatures from the circus around him, he doubted anyone would pay him much mind. It was almost an hour before Herman Fuller walked into the tent. By this point, Reese expected him to be walking in with surgical equipment, gloves, maybe even a saw, but the man had nothing in his bare hands. Herman Fuller asked him if he ever heard of Joseph Merrick. Reese didn't answer. Of course he'd heard of the Elephant Man. The whole world had been talking about Joseph Merrick for months. A man born so hideously deformed that people had compared him to an elephant, though the resemblance wasn't that convincing. This sentiment was clearly shared by Fuller, who placed one hand on either side of Reese's face and began to softly massage his cheeks, explaining how disappointed he was that Merrick didn't actually look all that much like an elephant. Reese's cheeks started to hurt as the man massaged him, almost as if he was stretching and pulling at his face, finding loose skin. The boy asked Fuller what he was doing. The circus master just smiled at him and explained that it was an old technique handed down in his family. A gift, he called it. He started touching Reese's nose, gently pulling at it with more and more pressure. Much to Reese's surprise, he felt his nose elongating, growing longer and longer in the man's hand. He tried to twitch his face and was starting to find that his new nose twitched along with it. The longer it grew, the more painful it felt, the skin and flesh from his head being ripped and pulled into a new shape. At several points, Reese felt ready to pass out from the agony, but the circus master kept talking to him, kept him awake through the whole ordeal as he molded the boy's face like clay into the shape of an elephant. Lying on the bench panting, Reese could see his trunk from between his 2 eyes. It was a nightmare. That was all it was. But then Fuller reached under the workbench and lifted out a small hand drill. One by one, he punched holes into the top of Reese's trunk, installing little valves like a trumpet as he went. Standing back to admire his handiwork, he told Reese that he would be his new favorite attraction. "My boy, I have made you into a star." The tusks did not come straight away. Over the course of several months, they slowly and painfully emerged from his deformed jaw. His elephantine legs were also not part of his initial transformation, but instead came as a result of health issues he developed while being trapped in a cage for several decades. Crowds of people would come and go, flocking to see the Elephant Man. Having spent the first part of his life constantly hungry, Reese was now being overfed every day. Hands would come to his cage and force him to eat rich, fatty foods, denying him any possibility of exercise. The broad shoulders and strong legs that he had developed while working at the circus melted away under layers and layers of fat. His skin went gray and papery, folding and wrinkling in on itself, either from Fuller's magic or just from a lack of sunlight. Whatever it was, with every passing day, Reese Freeman steadily became more and more hideous. SCP-4409 was stuck in the circus for much of his life. Eventually, Herman Fuller moved on and is currently being hunted by the SCP Foundation. When he did, SCP-4409 was able to bargain for its freedom from the circus. Wandering from city to city, never sticking around for very long, SCP-4409 begged for change at the side of the road. Some people would feel sympathy, while most would feel horror at its disfigurement. From its years trapped in a cage, SCP-4409 has developed severe health issues, including gout, severe obesity, and metabolic syndrome. While in Foundation custody, it is fed a special diet to counteract these conditions. As of yet, the Foundation has no way of reversing what was done to Reese Freeman in the tent in the 1800s. As Reese poses no threat to the Foundation, he is allowed to live with relative freedom, or at least as much freedom as a contained SCP can earn. His health condition severely limits his mobility around Site-66. a low-security residential containment area. Unable to walk even moderate distances, SCP-4409 heavily relies on the use of a cane and a heavy-duty walker, capable of supporting up to 140 kilograms. Researchers listen intently at his door, waiting to hear if he's ever going to play a sad song on his trumpet, but no sound ever emerges, except for his heavy breathing and spluttering coughs. It appears that having spent decades locked in a small cage, a sedentary life is all he knows now. With every opportunity to exercise, read books, and take up new hobbies, SCP-4409 appears unable to engage with anything other than sitting and staring at the same spot on the wall every day. If an animal has spent its whole life living in a zoo and finds in its old age that one of the walls has fallen down, what use has it in taking a step outside? Over the years, a considerable number of innocent people had unknowingly wandered into SCP-3008. Otherwise known as the Infinite IKEA, this extra-dimensional space more than lived up to its nickname, consisting of an IKEA store with no known limit to its endless aisles upon aisles of flat-pack Swedish furniture. But given the veritable labyrinth contained beyond the seemingly ordinary automatic doors of SCP-3008's entrance, it was rare that anyone making their way inside ever made it back out alive. On top of that, there was little the Foundation could do to ensure the safe return of anybody unlucky enough to find themselves lost in the Infinite IKEA. Once inside, navigating a way out was made almost impossible given the scope of the spatially anomalous store. And then, of course, there was the staff. These tall humanoid creatures roamed the aisles of SCP-3008, sporting a lack of facial features, disproportionate bodies, and wearing the typical uniform of an average IKEA worker. "I think it's becoming a concern," researcher Conley declared. "No, a problem. Just how many people are going missing in SCP-3008? What else can we do?" Her colleague researcher Kylan replied, shrugging their shoulders. "We keep watch over the entrance and stop anyone from entering." "But ours isn't the only entrance," Conley retorted. It was true. Based on evidence gathered from some survivors that had made it out of the Infinite IKEA, the entrance seemed to exist in multiple parallel universes. Say we could figure out not just a way to navigate through SCP-3008 with better accuracy so people can make it back out, but what if we could use it? Kylan jumped in, finishing the sentence. "It could be like an interdimensional spaghetti junction, a hub to access all sorts of other alternate universes. We could send people through the entrance in our universe and they could make their way through 3008 and out into another." "Exactly," their fellow researcher smiled. "One problem though," they said. "What do we do about the staff?" The inhabitants of the Infinite IKEA were undoubtedly an obstacle standing in the path of Conley and Kylan's idea. The faceless creatures were known to be docile during the daytime cycle within SCP-3008, only to turn violent and attack anyone present when the lights dimmed. "They're part of the problem," Conley mused. "But what if they could be part of the solution?" The SCP Foundation hadn't had much chance to examine a live instance of a staff member, known as SCP-3008-2s, up close. As such, they had a limited understanding of exactly what these creatures truly were, beyond the few they had witnessed chasing survivors out of the entrance. Were they intelligent? They were apparently able to speak, if only uttering the phrase, "The store is now closed. Please exit the building." Did they have the capacity for independent thought, free will, and emotionality? There was only one way to find out, and so Conley presented her plan to capture a member of SCP-3008's staff for closer examination, not knowing the bizarre chain of events that would unfold as a result. Drawing it out was the easy part of the plan. After all, the Foundation knew that SCP-3008-2s were able to react to the presence of human beings within the Infinite IKEA. So Conley proposed sending in a single member of D-Class personnel with a line of cable attached to them, tethering them to just outside the entrance of 3008. They were like the bait on the end of an interdimensional fishing line and would hopefully catch the attention of a staff member and lure them out. "What do we do once it's out?" Kylan had mused. "I mean, we know so little about their biology. We could use knockout gas, but what if they don't breathe? We could tranquilize it, but what if they don't have blood?" It had been the one hitch in Conley's plan, although she had suggested they use pure force, trapping the staff member like a wild animal before bringing it back. And sure enough, as an instance of SCP-3008-2 came racing out of the Infinite IKEA, Hot on the heels of the D-Class, Foundation security officers were able to swoop in and capture the creature, restraining it and bundling it into a transport back to the site. However, upon receiving their captive staff member, Kylan and Connolly were faced with a new problem. The creature seemed to be in its passive state. It didn't seem to be aggressive while away from SCP-3008. Kylan had posited their theory that the staff's attack state was linked somehow to the day and night cycles within the infinite IKEA, and now separated from that space, the SCP-3008-2 would remain docile, but the larger issue was communicating with it. As patient as Connolly tried to be with the faceless, mouthless humanoid, it seemed to be totally unresponsive to verbal communication. Any question she or her colleague Kylan asked the staff member, it offered no response. Dialing it back to more basic methods of communication, it didn't react when presented with symbols, unfazed by letters or numbers, or even straightforward pictograms. No matter what they tried, the staff member they had captured seemed not unwilling, but unable to respond.
Oh, there's gotta be something we haven't tried,
Connolly urged, her frustration building after a long day of trying to get through to the creature.
They're capable of speech, we know that from witness reports.
Well, maybe they're a hive mind, Kylan mused, equally exhausted after their efforts.
What if it shares a consciousness with the other staff? Like a drone in an ant colony. Hey, that's what we should name this one, they added. D for drone.
Can we focus here, please? Researcher Connolly snapped. It's almost like we need some way of enhancing it, granting it the right higher brain function so it has the ability to speak with us.
Hold up,
her colleague replied.
You said we need a way to enhance it, but what if we refined it?
What Kylan was insinuating was obvious, albeit a direct violation of the Foundation's own rules. SCP-914, otherwise known as the Clockworks, was an anomalous contraption of unknown origin. Two booths connected to the machine, one labeled input and the other output, could be used to disassemble, recreate, improve, or destroy an object that was placed within SCP-914. Although there was yet again another hurdle Connolly and Kylan would have to attempt jumping over. The Foundation had banned the use of the Clockworks on biological organisms. The pair submitted a request to their Foundation superiors for access to 914 and permission to use it on D. Kylan hadn't expected their suggestion to be met with anything short of a resounding no, and while determined, Connolly couldn't help but find herself worrying about the possible, highly likely rejection, which made it all the more surprising that their request was not only granted, but the experiment approved by the O5 Council themselves. Clearly, the highest operational staff within the Foundation had some keen interest in whether the Clockworks could refine an SCP-3008 staff member. More likely, their interest was in what benefit the experiment could potentially lead to. If the Foundation possessed a refined staff member, its own agent within the infinite IKEA, the possibilities could be of great advantage to the O5 Council. They were less concerned with having an intermediary, using D to communicate with the other SCP-3008-2s, or negotiating the potential release of the displaced innocent people lost inside the infinite IKEA. If refining D could mean the Council had a way to safely reach other alternate universes by traversing through SCP-3008, then that bridge between worlds would be theirs to control. Of course, Kylan and Connolly were more interested in what refining D could tell them about the staff and the nature of SCP-3008. Did instances of SCP-3008-2 have needs or wants? Could they even possess the capacity to want things? Were they fulfilled with their lives as anomalous IKEA workers? And how did they navigate the maze of endless aisles? Imagine it, Connolly theorized. If D can communicate with them for us, we could open up trade with them. The canteen inside SCP-3008 endlessly refills with food. Just picture what this could mean if we work out a system of distributing that resource out of the IKEA. It could change the world, she exclaimed excitedly.
Only one way to find out, right?
Kylan replied. They watched as D, their captive staff member, was nudged into the input booth of SCP-914. Connolly gave the research assistants a signal to activate the Clockworks, hoping that refining D would allow them to be capable of speech and free thought. However, either through miscommunication or a secret order from above, one of the assistants had incorrectly calibrated SCP-914. It was meant to be set to fine, which would improve whatever was placed in the machine, but instead the dial had been turned to very fine, which improved the target item to an ever greater extent, often granting it anomalous properties. Before anyone even noticed the change, the gears and gyros of SCP-914 clicked and whirred into life, making a raucous noise of moving mechanical parts.
destroyed in the input booth, only to be reconstituted into something altogether new in the output one opposite. D emerged from SCP-914 after the process was complete. Its clothing seemed to have experienced the most noticeable change. Instead of being the usual yellow shirt and blue trousers IKEA uniform worn by the rest of the staff, D was now sporting the same clothes, but the colors seemed to be shifting, almost like the natural camouflage of a chameleon. They were still faceless, their bodies still incorrectly proportioned compared with a human, and for the most part, D seemed unchanged. But before Kylan and Connolly could move in to take a closer look, before they were even able to check if D could speak, the staff member vanished in the blink of an eye. An instant state of panic erupted throughout the Foundation facility. Alarms were howling over a containment breach. Security teams were dashing through every wing of the site to track down D. Swept up in the chaos that quickly ensued, Conley and Kylan received another message from the highest point up the chain of command. Find that staff member and bring it in alive, or there would be hell to pay from the O5 Council. But somehow there was no sign of D anywhere in the facility. They had gone. Scans of the building revealed that all members of personnel, all anomalies, and other registered forms of life were all accounted for. It was only when Kylan ran through the mess hall that they realized where their refined test subject had gone to. "Hey, turn that up!" they yelled to a security officer who had been quietly enjoying his lunch break. Standing on a chair, he reached up and raised the volume of a TV that was mounted to the wall overlooking the mess hall. The screen was depicting a live news report. The anchor on the ground standing outside the entrance to an ordinary IKEA store. "I'm standing outside the very store where this bizarre turn of events have taken place," the anchor explained. "Police received numerous calls regarding sightings of an unknown figure said to be scaring shoppers. However, they only responded when this clip went viral on social media." The report cut to cell phone footage of none other than D inside the store. Their uniform had shifted into its typical IKEA colors, almost like it had adapted to suit the place it had somehow transported itself to. From the mess hall, Kylan watched the footage in a mix of shock and confusion. Naturally, the reaction from bystanders was one of fright at the individual's rather odd faceless appearance. Some took to Twitter, posting images calling it some form of viral marketing hoax. Others claimed it was a publicity stunt by IKEA to boost sales, although in a statement the company denies these accusations. However, it was then reported that the supposed creature began, I'm reading this right, aren't I? The anchor paused for a moment. Started helping customers by directing them to store departments, recommending different IKEA furniture, and perhaps, strangest of all, did all this via, oh come on, really, telepathic communication. Conley had appeared in the mess hall just in time to witness the news. D had gotten free and immediately sought out the nearest IKEA to work there. The next few hours contained a maddening slew of new information bombarding the Foundation, as researchers Kylan and Connolly scrambled to figure out some way of recapturing D. It didn't seem that the SCP-3008-2 instance was a danger to civilians. In fact, most reports stated that they were rather friendly. Any customers that had interacted with the creature described its new communication patterns in 5-star reviews they apparently felt compelled to start posting online. "I've never experienced anything like it," one wrote. "D offered the most delightful customer service I have ever received. That's why they must have gotten their name, D for delightful. It's not like D speaks in your head," another review explained. "It's more like they just give you their thoughts beamed directly in there. I said, 'Where can I find the bathrooms and fittings department?' And instantly D had given me the directions. It was as if I'd always known." Having an anomaly like D out in the open raised all sorts of problems for the Foundation. For one, they would not have to only scrub every mention of the staff member from the internet, but also track down anyone that had interacted with D to administer amnestics. But that was far from the worst of it. The researchers had been so caught up in coordinating a recapture effort that they didn't realize how rapid and extremely widespread the D reviews were getting. They were being left on customer satisfaction boards for stores in different states within minutes of each other. It took only 15 minutes for a review that mentioned D to be left in a store that wasn't even an IKEA outlet, but a convenience store. "Thank you, D, for such lovely and speedy service at the cashier's desk. Never had such a nice conversation and interaction with anyone else in the store before," the review read. The news that D could seemingly be in multiple places at once, appearing in different stores, was confirmed when Conley and Kylan saw photos posted online of the creature, wearing what looked like a number of alternate uniforms. It seemed that D's clothing, once exclusively just an IKEA shirt and pants, switched to match the uniform of whichever store they started to work in. and the more they worked, the more places they seemed to appear. Perhaps the most shocking development came almost 50 minutes after D had been refined and had disappeared. Once again turning their attention to the news, researcher Kylan watched as the manager of a huge supermarket franchise store appeared giving an interview live, talking about how the altered SCP-3008 staff had caused him to change his entire business practice. "Listen, D is great. Our customers love D. I hear the company's shareholders love him too. One thing's clear, we all love D," he said jovially, but something was unnerving about his gleeful smile. "So to show them our appreciation, I am hereby announcing that, effective immediately, all my retail staff are no longer required to come into work. D does it all, so there's no need for anyone else. They're friendlier, quieter, they work faster, and they're more efficient than any employee on my payroll. That's right, folks, D's here to stay." Naturally, this move sparked serious controversy, with the store's disgruntled, now former employees finding themselves out of work. A number of them took to social media in an outcry of dissatisfaction. "This isn't fair. I've worked every weekend through college at that store, and now I'm fired just like that? Thanks a lot, D," one of them protested. "It's all a corporate ploy," another wrote. "The rumor is that the only reason they're laying us all off so quick is because D doesn't technically count as a human employee, so they don't have to pay them. They're working for free, so the store manager and the company that owns the store can keep every penny of the profits." The justified outrage seemed to go willfully ignored as another store announced it would be adopting the same policy, firing all its staff and letting D take over their duties. More and more photos started pouring in right before Connolly and Kylan's eyes of multiple refined SCP-3008-2 instances working behind cashiers' desks, refilling shelves with products, assisting customers. These seemed to be acting out of instinct, like they couldn't help being staff. It was their purpose. The horde of anomalous staff members ended up swarming over the country's retail industry simultaneously, like the drones of an ant colony. "Kylan, what the hell have we done?" Connolly asked, staring in disbelief at the TV screen. "We've done the unthinkable," they answered, equally horrified. "We created a monster. We took D out of SCP-3008 and made them into the most powerful retail worker on the planet." Within hours, every retail outlet of every different description, not just IKEA, had reported the firing of their entire staff, and every business that did was now raking in record profits. Droves of shoppers flocked to stores, all enjoying D's customer service so much that they were taking any excuse they could to rush out and buy, well, anything. As stock supplies started to deplete, more and more instances of the altered SCP-3008-2 appeared, taking over the supply chain and distributing products to the various stores they were working at, refilling the shelves in record time. Naturally, the O5 Council was furious. Researchers Kylan and Connolly had hoped to present them with a refined SCP-3008 staff member that could allow them to better understand the infinite IKEA. Now, the Council's ulterior motive of having access to an interdimensional bridge of other universes had been dashed. As if that wasn't bad enough, and the added hassle of D rapidly becoming a worldwide sensation, the economy was destabilizing. Thanks to the retail companies firing their staff and hoarding massive amounts of profit from all their stores, and thanks to having D compulsively working there, refining an SCP-3008 staff member looked like it was about to collapse the stock market and plunge the whole world into chaos. Our bad? Researcher Kylan shrugged, unsure what to say after they and Connolly had just been brought before the shadowy O5 Council to be reprimanded. There was only one thing for it. D had to be taken out of the picture, and quickly. The more they worked, the more they seemed to be able to multiply and spread. Then, with a greater number of D instances within a store, the faster and more efficient they were able to work. So in retaliation, the O5 Council begrudgingly activated Mobile Task Force Alpha-1, better known by their codename, Red Right Hand. This task force reported directly to the Council. They were some of the Foundation's most loyal operatives, and it was far from their first assassination mission. Well, they had assumed it would be an assassination, dispatching the Red Right Hand to a nearby IKEA where D had first transported themselves to after exiting 914. Of course, the place was overrun with D duplicates, but even after clearing out the entire store and administering amnestics to any customers that witnessed it, there were still plenty more of D out there. The Council quickly realized that they'd have to send MTF Alpha-1 to every branch of every outlet in the country, systematically taking out every duplicate of D in a lengthy cleanup operation until they were no more. It seemed the Foundation's personnel had their work cut out for them. Hopefully, they'd be entitled to a raise and some paid time off after all of this was over. Who doesn't love their pets, right? Whether it's a dog, a cat, a goldfish, or a hamster, any pet owner will tell you that their furry friend is so much more than just an animal that they adopted. To many, pets become permanent additions to the family. While they might not look like a human being or even have the ability to speak the way we do, a lot of owners view their pets as people in their own right. Of course, a person can't be a pet. At least a human person can't, right? Well, not unless you happen to be a part of SCP-1897, otherwise known as the Human Domestication Society. If you've ever been brave enough to travel alone to the rural parts of southwestern states like Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Utah, or Nevada, then it's likely you would have been an ideal victim for SCP-1897. This designation doesn't refer to one single creature or entity, but rather a group of similar beings. Witness testimonies and photographs of SCP-1897 depict them as humanoid creatures, standing approximately 5 meters in height. These beings have displayed a speed and strength far beyond that of any human. They are capable of traveling roughly 200 meters in only 9 seconds, and lifting weights of up to 500 kilos with a single hand. These entities are not immortal and can be harmed by conventional means, but that doesn't mean it's an easy task. Any SCP-1897 instance that is killed or incapacitated immediately vanishes, resulting in them dropping anything that they may have been carrying at the time. And surprisingly, these are not mindless monsters, and actually appear to be capable of communication. Furthermore, they do not seem to speak a unique or distinct language, but instead communicate in standard American English, with accents and vernacular appropriate to the regions they appear in. However, they will actively refuse to reply to any human that attempts to engage them in conversation. Now, these creatures don't spend every waking hour of the day roaming around the states of Texas, Oklahoma, and all the others we listed. If they did, it's likely a lot more civilians would have spotted them by now, and would probably live their lives in fear of these gigantic 5-meter-tall humanoids. But instances of SCP-1897 will only manifest if certain specific criteria are met, and these are as follows. To encounter SCP-1897, a person must be alone or part of a group of no more than 2. If more than one person is with them, then no manifestation will occur. There is one exception to the rule: if a child under the age of 12 is present. Secondly, neither the person nor anyone with them can be carrying any kind of weapon. That means no knives, no guns, not even pepper spray. Third and finally, they must be at least 25 meters from a major population center. And what happens when all of these conditions are met and one of these creatures appears? Anyone witnessing their arrival will notice the creatures materializing, appearing to emerge from some form of unseen vehicle. When they manifest, the SCP-1897 entities are almost always carrying long poles with large nets at the end, as well as steel cages, and are often seen wearing dark green uniforms. In most cases, they will attempt to capture any nearby person in a way that causes them the least possible harm. Should an SCP-1897 creature successfully apprehend a person and place them in a cage, both them and their captive will vanish in a similar manner to the way the creature appeared. All attempts to track SCP-1897 or one of its abducted victims have failed. There is no way to know where they are taken, but as far as what happens to them, that we do have a little more insight to. Sometimes, although it is a highly rare occurrence, the captured human victims may reappear around a month after their capture, while never in the same location as where they disappeared from. They will always be accompanied by an SCP-1897 instance and will stay close by the creature's side. At this point, the abductee is barely human anymore. They are considered an instance of what is known as SCP-1897-1. What signifies this sudden and drastic transformation? For one, these victims are always found to have been forcibly castrated or sterilized, essentially no longer able to reproduce the way humans naturally do. For another, these instances of SCP-1897-1 universally display a decreased level of cognitive and mental function. What we mean is that their brains do not function the way they should anymore. Instead, these abductees exhibit the same level of intelligence and capability as the average Canis lupus familiaris, otherwise known as the common domestic dog. Should someone attempt to rescue a person that has become an instance of SCP-1897-1, or display hostility towards the SCP-1897 creature that accompanies them, they will be met with outward animalistic aggression from the victim. It has been discovered by the SCP Foundation that these behaviors can be treated with amnestics. Unfortunately, though, the process of an abducted person becoming an SCP-1897-1 instance seems to be the result of an invasive medical procedure known as a lobotomy. This typically involves removing or disabling certain parts of the human brain, meaning that what has been done to these victims is permanent and cannot be reversed. So who is doing all of this? Why are these creatures collecting innocent human beings only to reduce them to little more than animals? The answers lie in something currently referred to as SCP-1897-2, not another creature or entity, not an anomalous artifact or location with strange properties, but a website found at the address www.hdsociety.gov. According to the information on this site, it belongs to a group calling themselves the Human Domestication Society. The website features pages such as adoption, training, breeding programs, volunteering, and more. The fact that this is the kind of website you might expect to be about dogs or cats but instead focuses on the domestication of humans is certainly enough to turn the stomach. As we said at the start of the video, surely a human being can't be somebody's pet, right? Wrong. At least as far as the Human Domestication Society goes. Their website contains everything and anything one of these SCP-1897 creatures could ever hope to learn about owning a human as a pet. Has your human been misbehaving? Need to train them to use the toilet? These pages have all the information you need to help your human become the most well-trained human on your block. Boast the training page of www.hdsociety.gov. The remainder of the page contains links to various articles such as obedience training, which claims an owner of a human can show them who's boss without the need for physical violence. Also featured are mentions of how to toilet train or play fetch with a human, how to introduce a human to others due to them naturally not getting along. Perhaps most chilling of all is one article titled Understanding What Your Human Wants, that warns human beings shouldn't talk, and another, Dealing with Strays, offers tips for anyone wanting to learn to capture their own pets themselves. It doesn't seem like too much of a leap to think that the SCP-1897 creatures have followed a lot of the advice from this particular article. Arguably worst of all is an image featured on the website of a tall, menacing SCP-1897 entity brandishing a Picana Electrica. This device, for any unfamiliar with the term, is a form of high-voltage electrical cattle prod, normally used for the purposes of torture. In the photograph in question, the creature is wielding one of these while standing sternly over a helpless captive human male, now an instance of SCP-1897-1 with tears in his eyes. Further pages found on www.hdsociety.gov recommend solutions to certain human behaviors. For example, like one might expect to find on other pet care websites. Some of the Human Domestication Society's articles pertain to dealing with aggression, grooming, house training, and even toilet training. Then there's the adoption page, which states, "We offer a large variety of humans for adoption every single day. While we cannot guarantee a human you see listed on our website will be available when you reach the shelter, our inventory is updated every half hour. We cannot answer any questions about specific humans pictured on our website over the phone or email." It is still unclear whether or not the SCP-1897 creatures that have been known to appear in the southwestern United States are sent out to gather humans en masse to offer for adoption, or whether these creatures are individuals trying to obtain human pets on their own. Of course, the worst conceivable answer is both. The site is horrifyingly comprehensive, with links to an actual human ownership convention, with panels on breeding and preventing illegal human poaching and skinning. It's safe to say if that you were ever unlucky enough to read this website, it would haunt you for life. Naturally, the SCP Foundation has made several attempts to contact the owners of this website. They tried in vain to communicate through the official channels about SCP-1897-1 adoption, as a way of peacefully negotiating that the Human Domestication Society website be shut down,
as well as its practices of capturing, lobotomizing, breeding, and adopting humans. However, these communication attempts were met with silence. That is, until a message was received by the Foundation at Site-06, addressed to a member of personnel that does not exist. No data pertaining to the physical location of the sender could be derived from the email, but it was traced to the same IP address as the Human Domestication Society's website. The email read as follows: "We will not listen to your lies any longer. It was you who came after us first. You who tore holes in our world and tried to annihilate us. You who took our olive branch of peace and fashioned it into a spear. You who nearly drove us to extinction. And now that we have the advantage, you attempt to patronize us with your crocodile tears. We will not be deceived again. But unlike you, we're not monsters. We have much anger towards your kind, but we are willing to forgive. But first you must be willing to change. Slavery and genocide are immoral, and not even you deserve such a fate. It is our belief then that this alternative is a fair compromise between guaranteeing our safety and allowing your kind to live. This is our mercy to you. Look at the humans who have gone through our program. See how much happier they are? Your correspondence tells us that you have seen them. See how much they love us. Why then do you continue to be defiant? Someday you will thank us. Please try to understand that this is for your own good. For now, there is little that the SCP Foundation can do to prevent the Human Domestication Society from abducting human beings to sell as pets to other SCP-1897 creatures. Civilian access to the hdsociety.gov website has been restricted, so we recommend you stop typing into the search bar of your browser to go take a peek. Yes, we mean you. Seriously, stop that. As for the entities that have appeared in the rural areas of the southwestern states, all the Foundation can do is position its agents nearby, in the hopes that they can detain and neutralize the SCP-1897s as they appear, with lethal force if necessary. At present, the only procedure for any human pets that are successfully recaptured is to have them moved safely to containment until a way of rehabilitating them is found. So far, there hasn't been any luck on that front.
We really shouldn't be doing this, Adams argued.
It's fine, it's just a test, his fellow researcher Burton retorted in protest.
The containment procedures for SCP-914 come with a very specific warning not to test biological matter in it. If anyone had found out what we were doing, we would both be fired. Or worse, dosed up with amnestics and left on a sidewalk somewhere with no clue who we were.
Burton rolled their eyes. Adam's concern was hardly unfounded, but when they had discussed the idea earlier, he'd seemed open to it. Then again, it was only a hypothetical back then. Now it was getting closer to becoming reality. Look, aren't you tired of what we do here? Burton argued indignantly. So many of the tests we run end up with dead D-class personnel, blood everywhere, or just end up creating new anomalies that will just only go on to cause more people to die. I'm sick of it.
I don't think this course of action is the best solution to that, though, their colleague urged.
Why not? SCP-2800 is one of the few anomalies either of us have ever encountered that we can categorically consider to be good. He's not some heartless monster or vengeful cosmic deity, he just wants to do the right thing. I already mentioned it to him, he's more than happy to undergo the change.
And what if it kills him? Adams asked.
No, what if it works? Burton responded, sidestepping that possibility entirely. Worst case scenario, he might not survive, sure, but best case? We could turn an ineffectual would-be superhero into a tool to do some real, lasting good. The pair of researchers went back and forth, until ultimately, Adams conceded. It was hard to deny that throwing any number of other SCPs into the Clockwork refinement machine known as SCP-914 would easily yield far more destructive results. But SCP-2800 was, as Burton rightfully pointed out, a being of well-meaning intentions. If any average person were to wake up to find their body had developed characteristics consistent with that of a saguaro cactus, they'd likely seek out immediate medical assistance. But when that happened to Daniel McIntyre, he immediately sought to use his newfound condition and the anomalous abilities it granted him to offer assistance to any person that needed it as the superhero Cactusman, the spiked menace.
Unfortunately, when intervening in situations, Daniel proved himself to be somewhat ineffectual as a hero, although this didn't deter him from trying. Now housed in containment under the designation SCP-2800, Cactusman still continued to offer assistance to the staff of the SCP Foundation. His behavior came as the result of a few diagnosed psychological conditions, particularly his hero complex, a deep-rooted desire to help others, no matter the personal cost to Daniel himself. And it was this part of him that caused SCP-2800 to wholeheartedly agree to researcher Burton's test, unaware that the experiment had not been sanctioned by the wider Foundation. "Over here?" Cactusman asked as he stepped into the booth labeled Intake, following researcher Adams' directions. "That's perfect, 2800, the researcher replied, offering a thumbs up before he turned away, hiding his look of concern. "Shall we start with the 1-to-1 setting, Researcher Burton?" "The hell with that," Burton scoffed. "We've got maybe one attempt at this before security notices he's out of his cell and come here to find out what we're up to. We go big or we go home. I'm setting 914 to very fine." Burton strode over to the machine and threw the dial to the highest of its 5 settings, turning the key below. It wound the mainspring, and the entire device churned into life, the door to the intake booth sliding shut. Gears were spinning and grinding, the complex contraption of over 8 million moving parts starting its refinement process. Belts, pulleys, gears, springs, and SCP-914's other clockwork parts all began clicking and clacking, while SCP-2800 stood in the intake booth, growing more and more uneasy at all the noise this strange machine was making. Although the Foundation had little idea how its refinement process worked, SCP-914 seemed to take any object placed within its intake compartment and disassemble, recreate, improve, or destroy the item, depending on the setting its control knob was switched to. Rough completely obliterated an intake object on a molecular level, reducing it to little more than dust. Course dismantled the target into its base components, while 1-to-1 replaced it with a similar item of matching design, size, and quality. The next setting up fine would improve upon the base item, although usually without granting it any anomalous properties. And very fine, well, you can figure it out from there. You're smart. The last time a living being had been placed in SCP-914 on the very fine setting, it had been a D-class, and the results were catastrophic. A massive containment failure, numerous casualties including the test subject. Since then, no testing of biological matter was permitted in SCP-914. But Burton was convinced that SCP-2800's innate need to help people, his deep-seated hero complex, and generally kind nature would mean that the outcome was worth breaking the rules. SCP-914 was ticking and whirring, the noises of its components getting louder and louder with each passing second. So loud, in fact, that it drowned out the approaching clump of Foundation-issue boots. "Freeze! Hands in the air!" yelled one of the security team as they burst into Research Cell 109-B where the machine was housed. The pair of guards assigned to watch it lay tied up and unconscious on the floor. Both Researcher Burton and Adams threw their hands up as instructed, struck with panic at being caught in the act. The Foundation security personnel moved in, restraining them, clasping handcuffs tightly around the 2 researchers' wrists. Suddenly, the noise of the machine stopped. The guards all turned their attention to SCP-914, raising their weapons, training them on the output booth, with no idea what was about to step out. Timidly, as the compartment door slid open, Cactusman slowly emerged, looking around, confused. As far as Burton could tell from looking, SCP-2800 didn't appear to be any different. He cursed Adams under his breath, irrationally believing that he'd somehow changed the machine setting to 1-to-1 during all the commotion. That is, until one of the guards approached Cactusman to restrain him. As the security officer moved to cuff him, SCP-2800's arm whipped around, as if of its own accord. With the speed and precision of someone with far more hand-to-hand combat training than Daniel had ever received, Cactusman gently yet firmly swatted the Foundation's guard's hands away and turned him around. It had been so easy, so instinctive that SCP-2800 looked even surprised himself, barely able to believe the movements of his own prickly plant-based body. The guard tried to raise his arms again, only to find he couldn't. It was completely numb, in fact. Everywhere SCP-2800 had touched while deflecting him was the same, A series of long, sharp cactus needles from Daniel had been embedded in the security officer's uniform, piercing through his clothing and skin, all the way to his muscles. And yet, it was painless. He could hardly feel any of the sharp protrusions. Cactusman had disabled him with such effectiveness that the pain didn't even register. His spines implanted in the guard's body like acupuncture needles. Then, seeing what he had done, with an instinctive flick of his wrist, SCP-2800 made the spikes withdraw from the officer, and they shot back through the air, reattaching themselves to his body. Following the incident, and a severe reprimand for their unauthorized use of SCP-914, researcher Burton was assigned to reassess SCP-2800's new, improved abilities. The goal behind his investigation was to determine whether Cactusman had now been rendered a more useful asset for the Foundation, given he had retained his need to offer help to others. They were looking to make use of him. Sure enough, the existing anomalous abilities Daniel had exhibited before his refinement seemed to have become much more formidable powers. SCP-2800 had greater control over the growing of his prickly spines, as shown when he first emerged from SCP-914. Not only could he detach them at will, as he could before, but he seemingly gained an instinctive power to launch them as high-speed projectiles, neither recall them or regrow missing spines at an accelerated rate. On top of that, his reflexes seemed to have greatly improved, as had his fighting prowess, now able to take on multiple adversaries without one of them ever landing a hit on him. His cactaceous retention of water, making him able to survive on around 1/3 of the water needed by an average human male, was also improved. Now SCP-2800 could survive on next to no water without drying out. Even a few drops was enough to sustain him for an extended period. Additionally, no external factor could cause him to lose water his plant cells were retaining, even being in a high-temperature environment. His resistance to high temperatures, typical of many plants within the cacti family, had now evolved into SCP-2800 being fireproof. He was unable to catch a light, even after direct exposure to flame. Additionally, he had previously been able to empathetically connect and communicate with other cacti, often causing them to increase their water and nutrient absorption. Now, though, Cactusman could cause his fellow spiked plants to rapidly grow at an exponential rate, even producing cacti seeds that he could command to grow the instant they made contact with the soil or absorbed moisture retained by his own body. Despite the rules broken to refine him, the Foundation now had their very own plant-powered superhero, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice in the event of a containment breach, and more than happy to help. And it couldn't have happened at a more opportune time. Over the coming years, the Foundation granted permission for Cactusman to assist in various recontainment efforts when dangerous anomalies broke free of their cells. He ended up preventing the deaths of a lot of the Foundation's Mobile Task Force operatives, as well as their various personnel, purely by intervening, so they didn't have to put themselves in jeopardy. However, it was the eventual defeat of SCP-682 that allowed Daniel to really make a name for himself as the full-blown superhero he'd always wanted to be. Nobody was sure how it happened. All that really mattered was the monstrous, hard-to-destroy reptile was loose again. The crocodilian creature, famous for despising all other forms of life, had torn through the Foundation facility where it was being kept. It left a trail of destruction in its wake, causing multiple subsequent containment breaches. And while the Foundation mobilized its forces to try to limit the damage and re-establish containment of the various anomalies now freed, SCP-682 was making its way towards civilization, only to find Cactusman, the spiked menace, standing in its path. The monstrous lizard snarled at the sight of what it viewed as such a pathetic adversary. Even plant life, especially a sentient humanoid plant, was an abhorrent abomination to SCP-682. Civilians were running in terror of the hard-to-destroy reptile as it made its way through the city, slaughtering any in its path. And yet, SCP-2800 was standing bravely against it. "We both know they'll catch up to you eventually," Daniel called to the monster. "As soon as they'll do, it'll be right back in the vat of acid with you. I know you're not a fan of being locked up. I'm not either, but you need to go back to your cage." SCP-682 started laughing, a roaring, inhuman sound. It didn't feel the part plant creature was even worth a verbal response. Suit yourself, pal," Cactusman smirked. He started calmly walking towards the beast as SCP-682 began charging its way through the street, hurtling towards its enemy. Still, SCP-2800 strode without breaking a sweat. Not that a cactus can sweat. But whereas before he would have doubted himself, especially going up against something as big and ferocious as the hard-to-destroy reptile, now Daniel was cool and collected. With 2 seeds in his palm, they quickly grew into round spiked cacti that covered his clenched fists like boxing gloves, with sharp pointed needles sticking out of them. SCP-682 was almost upon him and launched a vicious swipe with its clawed arm. Moving with speed and the Matrix-like reflexes, Cactusman easily sidestepped the oncoming blow. Before 682 had time to launch another attack, 2800 countered with a Cactacorous countermove. He gave a series of quick jabs, each strike of his fist landing with enough strength to reel the crocodilian creature and leave sharp spines embedded in its snout. The hard-to-destroy reptile backed up, trying to create some distance between it and its surprisingly strong opponent. But Cactusman wasn't about to let this monster get another chance to attack. Raising both arms, he fired a volley of his cactus spines at the monstrosity, the barrage of razor-sharp needles shredding through the reptile's flesh. More were regrowing in the place of the ones now tearing through SCP-682, supplying Daniel with an infinite supply of spikes to shoot at the reptile as fast as it could regenerate from the damage. Suddenly still being impaled by the bombardment of needles, the crocodilian anomaly gave a wild, flailing swipe of its arm. The monster's claws cleaved ruts into Cactusman's chest. The aggressive move caught him off guard for a split second, just enough time for SCP-682 to thrash its tail and sent him hurtling across the street. Cactusman crashed into the sidewalk with enough force to crack the pavement, knocking down a lamppost and uprooting a fire hydrant. Water was spraying up into the air as he tried to will himself to get back up, struggling with his lack of arms until the cool spray of water came raining down on Daniel, and instantly he felt rejuvenated. It was stronger and more invigorating than any sip of coffee or energy drink on the market. Absorbing sunlight and moisture, he renewed his literal green fingers with more newly formed spines protruding through his chlorophyll-filled skin. In seconds, Cactusman was back to full form, ready to end this fight once and for all. Turning to face the sinister, scaly terror that was SCP-682, Daniel knelt and reached his hand into the cracks he had left in the asphalt. His fingers reached deeper right into the soil below, while SCP-682 began to menacingly draw nearer. It charged again, only to feel a rumbling burrowing up through the very earth beneath its feet, until, suddenly, something came bursting up from the ground, sending chunks of road up into the air, overturning nearby cars with the force of whatever was exploding up from below. Sharp, piercing pain ripped through the hard-to-destroy reptile's body at multiple points. Its arms, legs, torso were all impaled. Whatever it was kept burrowing upwards, lifting SCP-682 up off the ground as it climbed, grew out of the earth. A gigantic cactus had sprouted up, seemingly out of nowhere. It was huge, far bigger than any on record, the size of a large oak tree and still rapidly growing. Its spiked branches reached outwards as it climbed and climbed, pulling apart the limbs of SCP-682 that were impaled on its enormous needles. Separated into several angry, snarling, and thrashing pieces, the hard-to-destroy reptile was bested. All the while, SCP-2800 was concentrating on endlessly regrowing the spines of its miles-tall cactus he had created, keeping SCP-682 skewered, long enough for the Foundation to move in and recontain the infamous creature. Crowds of people had witnessed the battle and filmed it on their phones, some even live-streaming the showdown as it happened. By the time the Foundation was about to initiate a cover-up and start administering amnestics, the name Cactusman was already trending worldwide on social media. News crews flocked to the scene, rushing up to thank SCP-2800 for his heroism. People were cheering and clapping in their gratitude, and what's more, when fire crews and emergency services began tending to those wounded in the reptilian rampage, Daniel was seen aiding them. He helped clear rubble using his plant powers, clearing damaged vehicles and debris from buildings, and offering to help paramedics tend to the wounded. All this while watched by the adoring eyes of the people he wanted to save. It was too late for the Foundation to step in and sweep this incident under the rug. The whole world had seen Cactusman now, and they loved him. Of course, that didn't stop them from trying to recontain SCP-2800. But when shady vehicles and armored MTF troops appeared to whisk their new hero away, people didn't take kindly to it. Even while unaware of who the Foundation was or what they did, there was a massive public outcry for Cactusman to be released from whoever had taken him into custody. The Foundation did their best to ignore it, placing Daniel back in his cell for the time being. That was until the worldwide calls of Free Cactusman grew so loud that even the powers that be started to listen. The governments of the world slowly all started sharing their own support of the plant-powered hero who had risked his life for the safety of ordinary citizens he'd never even met. There were some who blamed the immense collateral damage caused by his fight with SCP-682 on Daniel himself, especially with the gigantic skyscraper-sized cactus permanently standing on the site where the battle took place. However, those detractors were eventually silenced by those with the growing concern of who would protect them if an incident like that ever happened again. Finally, the SCP Foundation were put under enough immense, unignorable pressure by the governments of every country that knew of their existence that there was only one course of action left. The door to Daniel McIntyre was unlocked and open for good, and Cactusman was free to go. The world welcomed him with open arms. He was awarded medals for bravery thanks to his efforts in saving people by fending off 682. Cactusman graciously accepted and offered to help out wherever he could, anywhere in the world. Over the coming years, working with intelligence and transportation provided by the Foundation, SCP-2800 was sent anywhere and everywhere. Wherever there was conflict or a natural disaster or even another containment breach, the world had a hero ready and willing to step in. People adored Daniel, with many growing varieties of cacti in their homes to honor his heroics, and just in case he ever needed backup should the worst happen. Cactusman had become a hero beyond his own wildest aspirations. But despite being adored and revered the world over, saving lives was never about fame or recognition to him. The fact remained that Daniel just couldn't help it. Even before being put inside SCP-914 and refined, he had always held doing the right thing above all else, no matter the impact it had on himself. He'd risk his own safety, risk being beaten up, injured, or worse, if it meant getting another person out of harm's way. Commendable, some might say, but that compulsion never left him. Even after ushering in a new era of peace, SCP-2800 still wanted to help save people. But was there anybody left who needed him to? Well, there was just one man. One Cactusman who still needed saving.
Bodies all over the ground, necks twisted, faces contorted in terror. SCP-173, not one but an army, scatters out through Site-19, massacring researchers one broken neck at a time. Pure chaos. How could this possibly have happened? The strobing of the blood-red emergency lighting was already fear-inducing enough, so was being hidden under one of the tables in the mess hall, trembling as the noise of alarms rang out through the facility. But the thing about the flickering lights scared SCP Foundation researcher Mira Smithy all the more, were the few seconds of darkness that came between each flash of red. If it had been any other containment breach, she probably wouldn't have even noticed, for in those few seconds, when the warning light lit up only to cut out, she couldn't see a thing, and her not being able to see made it easier for them to move around. Mira had lost track of time since the alarms had first sounded to mark the containment breach. She tried to keep count of the minutes, but the drumming of her heartbeat had thrown her off. There was no way of knowing if it had been hours or only a few minutes since everything went wrong. Of course, the SCP Foundation had plenty of procedures and protocols in place to prevent or respond to situations like this. Yet the emergency alarms kept echoing through the corridors, lights plunging the facility into darkness every few seconds, only to break it up with a brief flash of red. It seemed to Mira from her hiding spot that this breach had proven far too much for the Foundation's extensive procedures to counteract. Maybe it was all over already, she thought after a few seconds, or maybe minutes under the table. What if they had gotten bored, tired of slaughtering their way through Foundation personnel and slunk back to their containment chamber? That would have been simpler, far less terrifying than the alternative that came creeping into Mira's head in the form of her next thought. What if she was the only one left alive,
the last member of site personnel still breathing, just by some random 100-to-1 chance. And if that was the case, how long would it take for them to find her? How many even were there? A new sound, just detectable below the alarms, broke through her avalanche of anxious questions. Footsteps. The noise of boots clomping against the floor, clearly belonging to a human and not one of them. Cautious as to which way her gaze was directed, Mira poked her head from out beneath the table, glancing around during the few seconds where the red of the emergency lights allowed her to see. The steps were getting closer, and as they did, Researcher Smithy realized something that made her fearful for her fellow survivor. They were running away, and there was no way they could do that while also looking back at what was coming after them. "Over here!" she hissed in a hushed tone at the sight of a pair of legs crossing a nearby corridor. Their thick, standard-issue military boots seemed to match those worn by the Foundation's security personnel. The officer passed by, only to stop and tiptoe closer to the mess hall, having heard Mira's whispered call. With the red lights blinking, it looked like every other step the security officer took had been edited out, like they were teleporting closer in the dark. Watching intently from her hiding place, it reminded Mira sickeningly of the things she was hiding from, how they moved, and the worrying fact that she couldn't see one following the security officer. "Hello? Hello?" called a man's voice as he entered the mess hall. "Under the table," Mira whispered. "If we hide, we can still see them, but they can't see us." "Hiding?" he replied. "No, we need something that can revert these things back to the original. It was so much easier to handle when there was just one of them. Look, let's make a break for it. I'm gonna grab SCP-4108 and get the lights back on. If we can restore visibility, we might be able to stand a fighting chance against those things." The officer was looking around the cafeteria, trying to locate the source of Researcher Smithy's voice, eyes distracted. Then the intermittent flickering of red light cut off again, plunging the entire mess hall into near-pitch darkness. At the same time, there was the sound of something heavy and stone scraping against the flooring. It turned Mira's stomach, and she immediately covered her mouth. She had no idea if they could hear her breathing. Could a creature of stone even detect sound at all? While the lights were down and the security guard's back was turned, a pair of sculptures, built from concrete and rebar, traces of spray paint over their stone skin, appeared behind the officer at impossible speed. There was a sickening crunch, followed by the sound of something dropping to the floor of the mess hall. As the emergency lights flicked back on, Mira could see them. The two copies of SCP-173 standing still next to the table she was under, bathed in red light. This nightmare had all begun as an otherwise ordinary Friday for the SCP Foundation. Only a few hours earlier, Mira had been brainstorming her latest pitch for a series of experiments involving SCP-914. Otherwise known as the Clockworks, SCP-914 was a large machine comprised of various cogs, gyros, and gears of unknown origin. Its function, however, had long been documented and was of great interest to the Foundation. Any object placed within SCP-914's input booth could be transformed, destroyed, or improved, depending on the Clockworks' setting. Rough would disintegrate the subject, Coarse would dismantle it to its base components, and 1-to-1 would merely replace the object with a similar, almost identical one. Then there were the fine and very fine settings. The former would cause SCP-914 to improve any item, and the later is capable of the same but with one key difference. Very fine would refine an object even more, usually by giving it anomalous properties. The Foundation higher-ups had permitted staff to freely conduct tests using the Clockworks, although approval was required, and all data was to be recorded. While many of the scientists at the Foundation were fixed on the mysterious origin of SCP-914, or the furthest extent of its refinement capabilities, Myra had been thinking about it in a far more practical way. She wasn't interested in the how or the why of SCP-914's inner workings, nor who had built it. Her experiments were born out of considering better usages for the Clockworks. It was a machine that could provide endless possibilities, and Myra was determined to make it to the fullest use of it in order to solve actual real-world problems. "Imagine for a moment," she announced, reading off her cue cards as she practiced pitching her experiment to the Foundation's senior researchers. "Imagine a world where nobody ever gets sick, where human beings are able to live long, healthy, and prosperous lives. Maybe dial back on the Star Trek. Her colleague, research assistant Jensen, interjected. Really? That's what you call constructive criticism? She retorted before continuing. If we apply the transformative refinement powers of SCP-914, that world could be the future that awaits us. For example, I'm proposing tests that involve placing man-made chemical compounds like painkillers, heart medication, and other potentially life-saving medicines through the Clockworks refinement process. I'm not suggesting we need to set it to very fine and create anomalous versions of these things, but what if, even on the fine setting, we're able to improve the effectiveness of our existing treatments for all kinds of afflictions? Jensen raised their hand, patiently waiting to comment like a child in a classroom. What? Few things, they replied, lowering their hand. First off, some if not all man-made medications include some kind of organic component. The O5 Council have banned all— Yes, I'm fully aware of the containment procedures, Mira interrupted them. That's exactly why I'm trying to convince the Council, or hell, just even Dr. Bright, to let me step around. I genuinely believe we could be doing so much more with SCP-914, and I need them to see that. Look, I'm not here to rain on your parade, Smithy, her assistant reassured. I'm only bringing up concerns that anyone will have about this proposal. You talked about wanting to improve our existing medical treatments, which is noble, don't get me wrong, but have you considered the wider effect that might have? If you make everyone on Earth more resistant or even immune to everything, then diseases are going to evolve. What if we end up with a form of superbacteria resistant to all forms of medication, even if that medicine's been refined in SCP-914? Trying to save the world might just bring about its end. I've thought about that, but if the Council starts allowing for biological testing again, then the solution is obvious. We use the Clockworks to eradicate whatever germs or diseases are able to develop after improving treatment options, Myra explained, then adding, besides, that can't be any more dangerous than what we've been using SCP-914 for. I mean, enhancing other SCPs, that's a recipe for disaster. Got to agree with you there, Jensen sighed. Even without placing them in the Clockworks, the Foundation's been way too cavalier with the dangerous ones. Speaking of, you know what tonight is, Smithy replied with a confused look. Date night, they stated. Elsewhere in the facility, unknown to researcher Smithy at that time, one of the dangerous SCPs Jensen had mentioned had been let out of containment. This was a regular occurrence, even if it was considered a little unorthodox to some. In fact, the only reason that the O5 Council so often turned a blind eye to it was because of the researcher it involved, Dr. Alto Clef. It seemed Clef had a certain fondness for SCP-173, the sculpture, a living statue constructed from concrete and rebar that could travel at impossible speeds whenever it was unobserved. Most Friday nights, Clef would have romantic candlelit dinners with SCP-173, putting a dress and blonde wig on the sculpture and treating it like his beloved partner. The whole while watched by Dr. Clef and a group of D-Class acting as waiters and cooks, SCP-173 would stand motionless while the bizarre date went on late into the night. It was no secret that the sculpture was a highly aggressive creature, with a penchant for snapping the neck of the nearest person the moment that they blinked. However, it was only because of Dr. Clef's reputation and track record for the elimination of anomalies that he was granted the special privilege of wining and dining with SCP-173. This time though, partway through their regularly scheduled date, Dr. Clef was called away to deal with matters relating to another anomaly he'd been charged with decommissioning. The pair of D-Class waiting on the doctor and his date were instructed to wait, keep a close eye on SCP-173, alerting each other in case they needed to blink. It was a hell of a gamble, a risk that could have been avoided if the sculpture had been transported back to its secure containment chamber. But Dr. Clef could be persuasive. That is to say, he threatened both D-Class waiters with a bludgeoning from his ukulele if they didn't do as he asked. Both the D-Classes stared directly at the sculpture, each one feeling the anxious beads of sweat slowly crawling down their foreheads, worried that they'd both blink at the same time by accident. They announced their need to refresh their eyes every so often, alternating between being the watcher and the one allowed to blink. All the while, SCP-173 was motionless. Perhaps it was patiently waiting for Dr. Clef to return, or for one of the D-Class watching to slip up. As if through some cruel twist of fate, a fly began to buzz through the air, drifting towards the D-Class with their eyes on SCP-173. It looped and darted around, its wings making an annoying droning. One of the waiters announced he needed to blink again, and the other told him he was free to do so while he kept watch over the sculpture. At the exact same moment that one man blinked, the fly zipped its way towards the second D-Class, distracting him again and drawing his gaze for a little more than a millisecond. That fly whizzing past was the last thing he saw. As SCP-173 darted forward, it moved with such incredible speed that it was imperceptible, grabbing the nearby D-Class, the one who'd spotted the fly, and killing him instantly before the other could even open his eyes. When he did, SCP-173 had vanished from its spot at the date-night table, nowhere to be seen. Before the remaining D-Class could realize it was behind him, SCP-173 had made short work of its other observer. It began zipping unseen through the corridors of the SCP Foundation facility. Dr. Clef had returned to his date only to find the 2 D-Class waiters dead, and SCP-173 missing. Immediately, he had raised the alarm, meaning that research staff were too busy fleeing to safely pay any attention to the sculpture quickly making its way through the site. Swept up in the evacuation, half deafened by the alarms, in all the commotion, researcher Myra Smithy hadn't even realized she'd left the door to the Clockworks wide open. Shuffling down a corridor with her fellow researchers, the lights suddenly went out. A few nearby screamed in panic at having been unceremoniously thrust into the dark. Myra blindly reached for Jensen's hand, only to hear the sounds of multiple heavy concrete feet dragging along the floor. Suddenly, the emergency lights blinked. She turned, and to her horror, she saw SCP-173 with its stony arms around Jensen's neck, their face stricken with sheer terror, tears in their eyes. But now Myra quickly realized, as the corridor was filled with shrieks of fear from the other researchers, that there was more than one sculpture now. Myra barely managed to escape with her life in all the confusion, crawling out of the low-lit corridor on her hands and knees, while the multiple new SCP-173 instances slaughtered anyone that couldn't see them. Since then, she had been hiding, hearing the scraping steps of the sculptures traveling around the facility unobserved. They had attacked the fuse boxes first, as if in a calculated tactical move, take out the lights, and suddenly everyone found it much harder to see them. Even through the fear, it was hard for Myra not to blame herself for all the chaos. She couldn't remember whether she'd left the door to SCP-914 open or not, but it hadn't taken her long to figure out that the Clockworks had something to do with this madness. Somehow SCP-173 had made its way there, had been able to operate the machinery while the Foundation staff were distracted by their own evacuation. Presumably, with SCP-914 set to very fine, the sculpture had been transformed into its ultimate refined form, or multiple forms, it seemed. There was a veritable horde of SCP-173s running amok through the facility. It made sense, Myra reasoned, in some twisted, cruel, anomalous way. The sculpture had only ever been a danger when unobserved. The second anyone took their eyes off of it, so much as blinked, it would strike. How does a machine like SCP-914 improve upon that? Easy. It gives the sculpture the power to replicate itself. Anyone can look at multiple things at once, of course, but nobody can look at everything simultaneously. Even if someone was watching a pair or 3 SCP-173s, one more could easily slip up behind them for the kill. Still hidden under the table, Myra's eyes were locked on the pair of sculptures in the mess hall, the body of the security officer out of focus in her peripheral vision. She dared not look away, frozen in sheer fear that the second she blinked, they would lift up the table and find her. She had been so overwhelmed, so paralyzed with her terror, that she had forgotten about the lights. As the emergency lighting flickered again, the sculptures both moved, shifting across the mess hall as the room went dark, only to stop in place the second Myra could see them again. They hadn't gotten closer. In fact, both looked to be leaving. The only thing keeping them here was her. She was watching them, and it had frozen them in place. Their greatest strength, the imperceptible movement and speed of SCP-173, was offset by an indisputable weakness of their anomalous biology. They couldn't stop someone from looking at them, and couldn't stop themselves becoming still, solid concrete when they were being watched. Mulling over her options, Myra decided to follow through with the plan from the fallen security guard, to retrieve SCP-3108 and try to undo what the Clockworks had done. Slowly, she slipped out from under the table, keeping both eyes on the pair of sculptures, keeping them lashed to one spot as she gradually backed out of the mess hall. The lights went out and plunged the area into darkness again, and researcher Smithy could hear the heavy concrete scraping of the 2 sculptures looking for her as she blindly made her way through the facility. She managed to evade the roaming stone creatures, resisting her natural instinct to hide and looking directly at any she encountered on the way, making sure to stay out of their view If she saw them, she'd freeze them. If they saw her, they'd chase her. Eventually, fishing SCP-3108 out of a containment box, Myra held the weapon in her hand. It was a heavily modified Nerf gun, which she loaded a foam dart into and pulled the plastic slide back. The creatively named Nerfing gun had almost the opposite effect of SCP-914. Instead of improving something, SCP-3108 turned whatever was shot with it into an inferior equivalent object, something worse than itself. It just might work. Drawing the gun as she heard the sound of scraping concrete getting nearer and nearer, Myra turned the corner, coming face to face with one of the sculptures. She held the gun high, closing the gap between them, making sure she didn't miss, but wary she needed to fire before the lights blinked off again. She squeezed the plastic trigger, sending the foam dart shooting out of the barrel of the Nerfing gun. The flimsy projectile collided with the SCP-173 instance, bouncing off its head and landing on the floor. For a split second, the lights dimmed again, then came back on. Myra's heart had lurched in her chest, only to see that the sculpture hadn't moved at all. She leaned closer to it, blinking intentionally. It still didn't move. It was rooted to the ground, fixed. Just a statue, rendered powerless by the Nerfing gun. Excitedly, Myra knelt down and scrabbled on the floor to retrieve the dart, just as the emergency lighting flickered out again. In her excitement, Myra was too focused on reloading SCP-3108. That is, until she heard the shuffling of concrete and rebar behind her. The lights were still out, and she fumbled blindly for the foam dart. As the noise got closer and closer, her fingertips brushed the projectile, knocking it further away, when suddenly the lights came back up. But as she reached for it, Researcher Smithy felt a large, cold presence behind her, something huge and heavy, and made of stone and lingering at the very corner of her eye. Before she could turn around and face it, something grabbed Myra, and a sickening snap rang out through the corridor. Now go check out SCP-096 vs. SCP-173, and SCP-173 Origin Story How 173 Got to Site-19. Just be careful not to blink.